Hi guys. Tonight I want to take you far away from the noise of our modern world, to a time when the fields whispered secrets only the farmers knew, and gardens brimmed with vegetables that time has quietly forgotten. This is a story about the vegetables medieval farmers once grew, how they cared for them, how they ate them, and how those plants shaped the rhythm of daily life long before supermarkets and seed catalogues. Each chapter will gently guide you through a different piece of this world, and by the end, I hope you'll feel like you've wandered those medieval fields yourself. So, wrap up in a warm blanket, rest your head, and drift with me to a time of candlelight and cobbled kitchens. The rain had just stopped. A low, silvery mist clung to the sleepy fields that stretched beyond the village of Stow-on-Hare. It was spring, the kind that stirred something quiet but steady in the bones, and beneath the soil things began to wake. A farmer named Edric leaned on the crooked doorframe of his timbered house. His eyes, dark and deep like well water, surveyed his land. It wasn't large, just enough for a few narrow beds, a pen for pigs, and a pond where ducks stirred the surface like ghosts, but it was his, and it was enough. Adric's garden was his temple. There were no symmetrical rows, no perfect plots. Everything twisted and curled like the script in his grandfather's Bible. Still it worked. And the vegetables he grew, they were not the kind you'd find in today's bright grocery aisles. Some were strange shapes, others smelled unfamiliar, but all were as old as the hills. Vegetables the world had left behind. The first was skirret. Adric called it sweet root, because when roasted beside goose or boiled into porridge, it tasted like sugar spun from the earth. It had thin white roots like fingers that tangled into each other underground. Digging them up took patience, but patience was a virtue he knew well. His wife, Hilda, had once braided them into a crown on May Day. The memory made him smile. Behind the skirret patch was the good King Henry. Despite its royal name, it was a humble plant, with dark arrow-shaped leaves and a bitterness that turned smooth when wilted over the hearth's coals. Edric's children liked it with vinegar and lard. It was a perennial, came back each spring like a loyal hound, and it needed no tending, only thanks. And so he gave it. Further on was the patch of ramsons, wild garlic, where the air was thick with scent in April. This was not a cultivated bed, but a gift of the forest. When times were lean, which they often were, Hilda would gather these emerald leaves in her apron and fold them into dark bread, or press them into salted butter. Ramsons were magic. Even when winter still held its grip, they promised a green tomorrow. Not far from the edge of the woods stood a bed of Alexanders, a tall, proud plant with dark stems and clusters of yellow-green flowers. It had come long ago with the Romans, who called it the parsley of Alexandria. No one remembered its foreign name anymore, just its taste, somewhere between celery and something else you couldn't quite name. Edric used every part. Stems in stews, leaves in broths, seeds in baked cheesecakes when they were lucky enough to trade for dairy. The sun climbed slowly, a drowsy companion in the sky. Edric fetched his spade, a worn thing with a handle smoothed from years of work. His boots made soft thuds against the damp soil as he approached the salsify bed. This vegetable, long and slender, was sometimes called oyster plant, though few in the village had ever tasted a real oyster. The roots were creamy and delicate, almost floral, and when cooked gently in butter, they melted like snow on the tongue. The children didn't much care for salsify, but Edric didn't mind. He grew it for the quiet joy of it. The roots took months to fatten, and the blossoms, when they came, looked like purple stars. He let a few go to seed every year, just to see them bloom. Farming, after all, wasn't only about feeding the body, it was about feeding the soul. At the corner of the garden stood a cluster of sea beet, a cousin of today's chard. With glossy green leaves and red-veined stems, it swayed gently in the morning breeze. This was a plant of the coast, but it had found its way inland through pockets of trade and travel, carried by monks or merchants. Edric didn't know its origin, but he treasured it. Sea beet was tough, hardy and beautiful, the kind of vegetable that thrived even when everything else seemed to wither. Hilda often mixed it with nettles and sorrel for spring soup. Sorrel, with its lemony tang, danced brightly on the tongue and woke the senses like a spring thunderclap. It grew wild along the lane to the church, and Adric always picked a handful on Sundays, wrapping it in his sleeve until the service ended and he could return home. As he worked the soil, Adric's thoughts drifted. These vegetables, these forgotten treasures, were not just food. They were time capsules, carriers of stories. He remembered his mother whispering the names of plants as she weeded beside him, her fingers stained green. He remembered her telling him how her mother had done the same, and how each generation passed down not only the seeds but the knowledge of when to plant, when to harvest, and how to listen to the land. The cabbage came later in the season, crinkled and darker than the ones you'd find today. It needed space and time, so he gave it a special patch behind the barn, away from trampling feet. Nearby, there were turnips, not the bland kind, but sharp, peppery, and white-fleshed. They were boiled with bones in the cold months, eaten with black bread and sometimes, when fortune favoured, with a pat of goose fat. And there were parsnips. Oh, the parsnips. Longer and sweeter than carrots, which were still pale and spindly in these times. Edric believed parsnips were a gift from the saints. Roasted with honey or mashed into a warm, lumpy pudding, they were the closest thing to luxury he knew. A soft breeze carried the scent of damp earth and something blooming. Edric stood, brushing his hands on his tunic. The garden looked like a quilt, patches of green stitched with soil and shadow. It was not orderly, but it was alive. Each plant hummed its own soft note in the symphony of spring. Evening would come soon, and with it supper. Hilda would stew something from today's pickings, and they'd eat together by candlelight. Maybe the children would ask about the plants again, and Edric would tell them. Not just the names, but the stories, the little legends wrapped in leaves and roots. And perhaps one day those children would tell their children. Even if the world moved on. Even if the vegetables were forgotten by others. In this small garden in the heart of this medieval world, they would live on. Quiet, steady, eternal. That night, the hearth crackled softly, casting a golden hush across the timber walls of the house. Shadows danced along the beams, flickering with the rhythm of the flames. The children were already dozing in their straw-filled beds, their breath slow and warm under coarse wool blankets. Hilda sat on a stool near the fire, her hands weaving flax threads, and Adric watched the embers with the quiet intensity of a man whose thoughts were deep-rooted like the parsnips in his garden. Outside, the wind gently combed the long grass along the lane, whispering to the stars. Inside, the scent of boiled skirret and nettle soup still lingered, a perfume of earth and comfort. Adric liked to sit at the end of the day with his elbows on his knees and remember. Not everything, just little things. The colour of a leaf after the rain, the crunch of frost on the cabbage heads, the sigh a pig made when it lay in clean straw. These things held meaning, and the more he paid attention, the more he realised that the vegetables he grew were not only sustenance, they were memories themselves. He thought of his neighbour, old Wulfgar, whose garden once overflowed with plants that now grew nowhere else. Wulfgar had been gone 2 winters now, but Edric could still remember the taste of the small, wrinkled peas Wulfgar grew. They were unlike any other, blue-grey pods with pearls inside that held a flavour both sharp and sweet. Marrow fat, Wulfgar had called them, though Edric wasn't sure if that was a name or a description. Whatever they were, they hadn't returned since Wulfgar passed. His garden had gone quiet, overrun with thistle and dock, another little patch of history buried. That thought haunted Adric more than he liked to admit. A vegetable could disappear so easily. One bad year, one missed harvest, and it slipped into the dark. Gone, forgotten, as though it had never existed. He wondered how many flavours had been lost that way, how many leaves, roots and stems had once fed mouths now turned to dust. He felt a kind of sorrow for them, as if they were friends who'd moved away and never wrote back. The next morning, mist clung again to the land like a memory not yet willing to let go. The sun rose slowly, diluted by clouds that had no rush. Adric dressed quietly, careful not to wake the house. The air bit gently at his skin as he stepped into his boots and opened the door. The garden waited like it always did, silent and still, brimming with potential. Today he would tend to the cress beds. The watercress grew near the small stream at the edge of his property, where the water ran clear and cold, fed by springs older than the village itself. He knelt by the bank, where flat green leaves clung to the water's surface. Their peppery taste woke the tongue, cut through the fat of boiled meats, and added fire to cold meals. But more than that, they were hardy. They grew even in lean years, even when frost threatened to kill the young shoots. Edric liked that. He respected a plant that refused to die. As he harvested the cress, his fingers submerged in icy water, he noticed the movement of frogs nearby, small, greenish-brown ones that shared the creek's sanctuary. He took it as a good omen. Frogs meant balance. They meant the stream was clean, the soil was good, and nature still remembered its old ways. He carried the cress in a woven basket, its handle worn and smoothed by use. Beside the cress he tucked in a few sprigs of tansy, not to eat but to hang in the house. Tansy kept flies away and brought a fresh scent to the rooms. In spring, Hilda would make tansy cakes, a bitter, eggy treat laced with honey. Not everyone liked them, but to Edric they tasted like childhood, like feast days and music drifting through the alehouse door. Back in the garden, he checked the cardoon patch. Tall and statuesque, the cardoon looked like something from a dream. Spiny, silver-green leaves and thick stalks that tasted like artichoke hearts when boiled long and slow. Most folk didn't grow them. They took space and time and fuss, and their thorns made you bleed if you weren't careful. But Edric kept them anyway, mostly out of stubbornness, partly out of pride. They were his strange beauties, not meant for quick meals or hurried hands. They asked for patience, and he gave it. Next to the cardoons grew the lovage, a towering herb with a scent sharp as celery and a voice of its own. The villagers sometimes called it love parsley, and swore it brought strength to the heart and warmth to the bones. Hilda used it in broths, and Edric often chewed a leaf on long walks to the fields, its bitter green taste reminding him to stand tall. He moved now to the cow parsnip, a wild cousin of its sweeter namesake, not carelessly. It had its dangers, but with knowledge, with timing, you could use the young shoots peeled and cooked as famine food. It was a lesson in humility. The land gave, but not always easily. Some gifts required respect. By midday, the sun broke through the grey, spilling pale gold over the mossy fence posts and the upturned soil. Edric paused to eat, a heel of bread, a piece of cheese, and a pear he'd kept since autumn, its flesh soft and fragrant. He sat on a low wall near the bees, whose hive buzzed softly like distant singing. He liked to eat among the plants. It made him feel part of the cycle, not above it. He remembered, as he chewed, the tale of the monks from across the hill. They had once grown dozens of vegetable types in their cloistered gardens, keeping records in ink on parchment, varieties of onion, colours of bean, heights of barley. The abbey had burned decades ago, and the records with it. Only the stories remained, told by old men after their second mug of ale, when the tongue loosened and the past rose like mist from the fields. That evening, Edric visited a neighbour, young Edith, whose husband was still away on levy duty. She struggled with the garden, not for lack of will, but for lack of knowing. He brought her a basket, skirret, lovage, wild garlic, and a few sea beet cuttings, and sat with her as she asked questions. She reminded him of Hilda years ago, asking how to prune nettles without blistering her hands. He answered gently, slowly, like his own father had, watching her brow furrow as she imagined the tasks ahead. That was the thing about these old vegetables. You couldn't just plant and forget them. They demanded your attention, your memory. You had to pass on the knowledge like a torch, else it flickered out and was gone. As the sun sank behind the low hills and the sky turned the colour of worn linen, Edric returned home. His boots were heavy with mud, his back a dull ache, but his heart was light. In a world that changed faster than he liked, he had done something that mattered. He had passed on something old, something rare. And in the soft hush of twilight, as Hilda set a pot to boil and the children began to stir from dreams, Edric looked over his shoulder at the garden, his living memory, his quiet rebellion against forgetfulness, and smiled. The first frost came early that year, slipping across the village with the silence of a thief. By morning, every blade of grass wore a silver coat, and the thatched rooftops shimmered under the pale light of dawn. Edric stood at the edge of his field, breath ghosting in the air, boots crunching the stiff ground. His garden was quiet, cloaked in white. But beneath the frost, life held on, tough, slow, and waiting. There were still vegetables to tend, even now. Winter didn't mean rest for a farmer like Idrik. It meant storing, drying, pickling, and watching. Always watching. He turned first to the leeks, their long green stalks stiff with ice but still standing proud. Leeks were a treasure in the cold months, hardy, forgiving, and flavourful. They were the backbone of winter soups and stews. Hilda used every part. The white ends went into broths, the green tops dried above the hearth to flavour porridge or ale. He knelt slowly, carefully loosening one from the earth. The soil was like stone now, but he knew the trick. Pour a little warm water around the base, then wait. The frost would melt just enough to release the root. He worked this way, quiet and steady, until he had 6 good leeks bundled in twine. From there, he walked to the storage pit behind the barn. Beneath layers of straw and wood ash, he had hidden his root vegetables. Parsnips, turnips, carrots, though they were still pale and stubby, alongside a few precious celeriac heads. Celeriac, with its gnarled, knobby shape, wasn't much to look at, but its flavour was deep and warming, like earth and spice mingled into one. Not many grew it anymore. Too ugly, some said, too strange. But Idrik knew better. He brushed away the frost and lifted one from the pile. It was firm, cold to the touch, its scent already awakening as it met the air. This would go into the stew tonight, paired with the last of the smoked venison and thickened with barley. A proper meal for a winter's eve. As he worked, a robin perched on the fence post, head cocked. Edric paused, watching it. The bird's breast was bright as fire against the washed-out sky, its eyes beady and sharp. It chirped once, then flew off, disappearing into the hedgerow. He took it as a small sign that even now, in the sleep of the season, there was movement, memory, and song. Inside, the house smelled of dried thyme and ash. Hilda was crushing dried beans with a stone pestle, the rhythmic thump echoing in the quiet. These beans, broad beans, black beans, field beans, were another gift of forgotten soil. Most folks didn't care for them much, finding them bland or hard, but she knew how to bring out their soul. Soaked, boiled, and mashed with garlic and herbs, they became hearty spreads or added depth to simple meals. She glanced up as Idrik entered, brushing snow from his shoulders. Without words, they exchanged the comfort of long partnership. He handed her the leeks and celeriac, and she smiled, already planning the evening's warmth. While she cooked, Idrik set about his next task, sorting the seeds. At the far end of the main room was a small chest, rough-hewn, iron-bound, and old. Inside were dozens of pouches, each hand-stitched, each labelled with faded ink or charcoal. Wild chervil, medlar pit, mugwort, squill. These were the treasures that did not shine. No coin could buy them, no lord would care for them, but to Idrik they were priceless. He picked up a pouch marked simply, Carlin. Carlin peas. Dried and hard now, but when soaked and stewed they softened into something rich and sustaining. These were peas for fasting days and feast days alike. The kind you'd eat with mustard, maybe a little vinegar if you were lucky. They had a long lineage, grown by his grandfather's grandfather, passed through each generation with care. He checked each pouch, touched the seeds, whispered their names like prayers. Some he would sow again come spring. Others he would give to Edith, or to the old widow at the end of the lane, whose hands could no longer dig but who remembered the rhythm of the garden in her bones. Later, by candlelight, the family ate together. The stew was thick and fragrant, steam curling in the dim room. The children ate hungrily and between bites asked questions about the garden. Will the cardoon grow again next year? Why don't we eat the red mushrooms near the oak? Did Grandpa really grow black carrots? Idrik answered each one softly, letting the stories stretch and spiral. He told them about the old black carrot, so dark it stained your hands and sweet enough to eat raw. He described the wild sorrel fields where the sheep grazed, and how in years of famine folks had boiled the leaves into gruel just to fill their bellies. He reminded them that not every plant was safe, but every plant had a story. He watched their eyes grow wide, their minds absorbing these tales like thirsty roots. This was how knowledge passed. Not through books or laws, but through nights like this, when the fire was warm, the food was good, and the stories flowed like stream water. That night, after the children had gone to bed and the house had fallen into quiet, Idrik stepped outside again. The stars were brighter now, sharp as nails in the ink-black sky. The frost glistened across the land, silvering the fence rails and the bare branches of the plum tree. He walked slowly to the garden and stood among the sleeping plants. He thought of how each vegetable had travelled, some from Roman soldiers, some from Moorish traders, some from Saxon forests. Each one carried a lineage longer than his own, reaching back through time like roots through stone. The skirret, the celeriac, the cardoon, the peas, they were all whispers of distant lands, reshaped by the hands of farmers who had come and gone. He knelt and touched the soil, cold still, but not dead. It held within it the breath of spring, the memory of sun. Everything would return, in time. Not just the plants, but the meaning behind them, the knowledge, the care, the remembering. And so he stood there, in the frost-bitten stillness, feeling both very small and very connected. The vegetables would wait, as they always had, beneath the earth, and he would be ready, as he always was, to welcome them back. A week passed, and with it came the thaw. The frost that had once clung to every branch and root slowly melted into the soil, seeping back into the earth like a breath exhaled after a long silence. Small rivulets traced paths through the furrows of Adric's garden, glinting like glass under the weak sunlight. The ground, once frozen and stubborn, had softened just enough to stir underfoot. Adric moved slowly through the garden, his eyes drawn to the first signs of green peeking from the mulch and straw. Tiny, hopeful shoots. They were shy, not yet certain of spring, but brave enough to try. He bent down and brushed aside the protective cover from a cluster of leaves, revealing the early crown of good King Henry. The old perennial had returned as it always did, uninvited and yet welcome. He stood, wiping his hands on his tunic, and gazed toward the hedgerow. There, among the dormant brambles, grew his patch of orach, another forgotten leaf that turned red in summer and shimmered silver in spring. He had planted it years ago from a handful of seed gifted by a travelling friar. The man had claimed orach once filled monastery gardens from the southern coast to the northern hills. Adric believed it. The plant had an air of devotion, thriving in poor soil, tasting mildly of spinach with a hint of metal, like it had been kissed by a bell. Today, Edric had a task that could not wait. He would check the winter onions. Not the bulbing kind sold in great sacks, but small, ancient shallots that grew in clusters, winding into each other like knotted rope. They slept now beneath the soil, but their time would come soon. He walked carefully to their plot, the heels of his boots leaving soft impressions in the thawed earth. The onions had overwintered well. He could see the tips already poking through, thin and green and determined. These were from his mother's garden, saved each year, split and replanted. No one in the village grew them anymore. They said they were too much trouble, that there were easier varieties now. But Edric didn't mind trouble if it meant keeping something old alive. He knelt beside the bed and ran his fingers over the soil. It was cool but not cold, damp but not wet. Perfect. He marked the edge with a stick and murmured a few words under his breath. Not a prayer, not exactly, but a ritual. He did it every year, the same way. A nod to the land, a quiet agreement. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the yarrow patch had survived the frost too. Its feathery leaves were pale now, but they would return with vigour. Hilda used yarrow in teas and poultices, especially for fevers and wounds. It was one of those plants that lived between food and medicine, never quite one or the other, but both when needed. Later, in the small shed near the pig pen, Adric began preparing the tools for spring. The spade needed sharpening, the hose handle had split and would need to be wrapped. The seed trays, carved from scrap timber, were stacked neatly in a corner. He touched each one, remembering the countless mornings spent kneeling in the dirt, tucking seeds into the soil with the same care one might use to swaddle a child. He paused to open a small clay jar on the shelf. Inside were the seeds of scorzonera, a cousin of salsify with black roots and creamy flesh. Not many people remembered it. The name alone was enough to scare them off, but Edric had grown it every year since his eldest was born. Its flowers were golden, like dandelions made of sun, and its roots were a secret comfort in the coldest months. He poured a few seeds into his palm, long, angular and dry. They held the promise of something rare. That evening, while the sky turned to ink and the last light filtered through the mullioned windows, Adric sat near the hearth with his daughter Aelith. She was 10 now, curious, quiet and sharp. She had her mother's eyes and his patience, Together, they sorted seeds by candlelight, her small fingers nimble and sure. "What's this one, Da?" she asked, holding up a flat, pale disc. "That's purslane," he replied. "Grows low to the ground. Thick leaves, a little sour. Your grandmother used to eat it straight from the path." She nodded, committing the word to memory. "And this? Fat hen, or goosefoot, some call it. You can eat the leaves, cook 'em like spinach. It's a weed to most, but not to us." Aelith frowned thoughtfully. "Why don't other folk grow these?" Edric looked at the flickering candle, shadows playing on the beams above. He thought for a moment. "Because they forgot," he said simply. "They wanted food faster, easier. So they left behind what took time. But fast isn't always better, and easy doesn't always last." She didn't reply right away, just nodded slowly and kept sorting. After she had gone to bed, Edric remained, gazing into the fire. His thoughts wandered to the days when monks still kept vast records of every plant, every harvest, every leaf pressed between pages. He remembered hearing of a manuscript, long lost, that described hundreds of vegetables, how to grow them, cook them, preserve them. He wondered if it was true, or if it had burned with the old abbey, just another piece of knowledge lost to the flames. But here in this room, some of that knowledge lived on, in pouches of seed, in stories told by the hearth, in the hands of a young girl learning the shape of a leaf by touch. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of damp moss and something older, perhaps the ghosts of gardens long vanished. Or perhaps just the promise of spring returning, as it always did in its own slow and stubborn way. Edric closed the seed chest and banked the fire. Tomorrow he would begin the early sowing. Not many. Just the first trays, a test, a whisper, a beginning. And with them, the garden would begin to breathe again. The next morning came with a pale sun rising behind a veil of thinning clouds. The birds had begun to return, their songs tentative but clear, small trills of confidence that the worst of winter had passed. Adric stirred from his bed before the house fully woke, slipping quietly into his boots and woolen cloak, his breath fogging in the chill of the early hour. He made his way to the garden, where the soil was still cold but no longer unyielding. It was time for the first sowing, a quiet ritual, humble and slow, but full of hope. He carried with him a shallow basket lined with linen, filled with the seeds he and Aelith had sorted just days before, each pouch nestled carefully inside, tied with twine and marked with strokes of charcoal. The first to be planted were the broad beans. He selected a section of the garden that received the earliest light, where the soil had begun to dry beneath the straw covering. Broad beans were among the earliest to be sown, needing the cool air and wet earth to swell and split open. He parted the straw and ran his hands over the earth, feeling its texture, its readiness. The beans were large and pale, with skins like worn parchment. He dropped them one by one into shallow furrows, pressing them down with his thumb, whispering as he went. Not words exactly, but a hum, a low tune his mother used to sing when planting. It wasn't for magic. It was for memory. Each sound tethered him to those who had come before. Behind the beans he sowed rows of parsley and chervil, their seeds tiny and delicate, the kind you had to mix with dry sand just to see them clearly. They were slow to rise, often shy in the cold, but once they came, they offered flavour and green brightness to the heavy meals of spring. Hilda prized them. She would pinch the leaves between her fingers, smell the oils, and know exactly when to harvest. As the sun climbed higher, Edric moved along the garden's edge, checking the beds prepared in the autumn. He had laid rotted manure over most of them, letting the frost break it down. Now the soil was dark and rich, alive with potential. He lifted a handful and crumbled it through his fingers. Worms wriggled and disappeared deeper, a good sign. The land was ready to receive. He paused at the edge of the old fava bed, now fallow for 2 seasons. It was where his grandfather had once grown mast beans, larger, darker, with a smoky taste when roasted. They had vanished from most gardens, replaced by lighter varieties, softer on the tongue. But Edric remembered their weight, their bite. He made a note to sow them next week when the weather steadied. Back at the house, Hilda was kneading dough, her hands strong and methodical. The table was dusted with flour and the air was warm with the scent of yeast and wood smoke. She glanced up as he entered, nodded toward the hearth. "I've set aside the bean soup from last night, still warm." Edric nodded and sat down, cradling the clay bowl between his palms. The soup was thick, flavoured with lovage and a bit of vinegar, the beans soft but firm, earthy and honest. He ate slowly, chewing each bite with reverence. These meals made from what the land gave and what their hands prepared held more comfort than gold. After breakfast, he fetched the old wheelbarrow from the barn. Its wheel was bent slightly, but it still rolled with enough grace to be useful. He loaded it with mulch, half-rotted straw and ash, and began spreading it around the newer beds. The mulch would keep the weeds down and the soil warm, guarding the young seeds against the chill of late frost. While he worked, he thought of the old stories told by the elders, tales of vegetables that could heal wounds, extend life, or summon dreams. There was the white beet of the east, grown in moonlight and fed with milk, the carrot so long it took a man's arm to harvest, the pea that sang when it bloomed. Edric knew these were only stories, but he also knew stories came from somewhere. He thought of Wulfgar again, his neighbour, his friend, and the strange vine he had once grown in secret. Small fruits, pale as bone, bitter to the taste, but said to calm the nerves. Wulfgar had called it fever gourd. No one else remembered it now. After Wulfgar died, the vine didn't return. Adric sometimes wondered if it had been real or imagined, but he still kept a spot open in the corner of his garden, just in case it came back. By late afternoon, the wind shifted. It carried with it the smell of tilled soil, hearth smoke, and something sweet, perhaps the first blooming blackthorn, or the sap waking in the trees. Adric leaned on his spade and looked across the rows he'd planted. They looked empty now, just lines in the dirt, but he knew better. Each line was a promise. Inside, the children were practicing their letters with Hilda. Aelith was tracing vegetable names onto scrap parchment. Skirret, Burdoc, Sorrel. Her younger brother, Toma, was more interested in drawing pictures of plants than spelling them, but Edric didn't mind, as long as they remembered, as long as the names weren't lost. At dusk, Edric climbed the small hill behind the house, the one with the view that swept down over the fields, the hedgerows, the slow-turning stream. He stood there as the last light faded, watching the shadows stretch across the land. From here, he could see the full shape of the garden, the old apple tree at its edge, the crooked rows, the way it curved to follow the land rather than defy it. He thought about how easy it would be for all this to vanish. A few missed seasons. A forgotten seed, a broken line of memory, but for now it remained, quiet, living, rooted in care. He knelt and placed his hand on the soil. It was cool, but it did not resist him. It welcomed the touch. He closed his eyes and let the stillness soak into his bones. The garden had begun again, and so had he. Rain came in the night, gentle but steady, tapping against the thatch like a long-forgotten lullaby. It filled the barrels by the barn, darkened the earth in the garden, and whispered over every roof in the village until even the dogs stopped barking and curled into their straw beds. Edric lay awake, listening. The rhythm of the rain was a comfort to him. Each drop felt like a blessing, a soft assurance that the soil would welcome the seeds, that life beneath the surface was stirring. By morning, the garden had transformed. The mulch steamed faintly in the early light, releasing a rich scent of damp straw and old leaves. Worms wriggled just beneath the surface, birds hopped through the puddles, and the first brave tips of green had already broken the earth. Broad beans, timid but stubborn, lifting their heads into the cool air. Adric walked between the rows slowly, his cloak damp at the hem. There was no rush. Every morning in the garden was a kind of liturgy, and he moved through it with the reverence of a man who knew the prayers by heart. He checked the cold frames, lifting the wooden lids with care. Inside, the early lettuces were beginning to form, small frilled leaves still glossy from the night's moisture. He smiled. These were an heirloom variety passed down from his mother's side. They didn't grow upright like modern heads, but sprawled out like fans, each leaf overlapping the next in a slow, swirling spiral. Behind the lettuces, in a shallow stone trench lined with river pebbles, were the roots of water parsley. It was an unruly plant, often mistaken for a weed, but Hilda loved its bright, biting taste. She used it in stews and teas, and sometimes chewed the stalks raw when her joints ached. Edric had transplanted it from the stream 5 years ago, and now it came back every spring without being asked. Near the fence, he knelt beside a patch of burdock. Its leaves were wide and heavy, like shields dropped from a forgotten battle. Most villagers cursed burdock for its burrs, but Edric cherished it. The roots ran deep, almost too deep for easy digging, but when roasted or stewed, they tasted like smoke and honey, a flavour the land gave only to those willing to work for it. He reached for his spade and began to dig, carefully following the taproot's path. It was slow work. The soil clung to the tool, and every inch demanded care. But at last he lifted a long, knotted root free from the earth. He held it in his hands for a moment, examining the patterns of its skin, the scent that rose when he brushed away the dirt. This root had slept through snow and frost and the dead hush of January. Now it would feed his family. By midday, the rain had passed, leaving the sky the colour of old wool and the air thick with scent. Edric moved to the farthest bed, where he'd sown seeds of ramson and sorrel weeks before. The ramsons had emerged quickly, as they always did, sharp and green, their garlic scent drifting on the breeze. The sorrel came slower, its red-veined leaves folding toward the light like cautious hands. He picked a handful of each and wrapped them in linen for Hilda, knowing she'd fold them into an egg custard or scatter them over oatcakes. These were the flavours of spring, clean, fresh, with a touch of wildness. They cleared the heaviness of winter from the mouth, reminded the tongue of brightness and bite. Later he visited the narrow border near the gooseberry shrubs, where his prized angelica grew. The stems were still young, pale green and streaked with purple. This was a rare plant in the village, grown mostly in monastic gardens where it was used for medicine and sweetmeats. Adric had traded a pot of honey and a cord of firewood for a single root years ago. Now the angelica stood tall and proud, its scent rich and musky. Hilda candied the stems each year, boiling them with sugar and drying them by the hearth until they were tender and translucent. The children called them green ribbons. He crouched beside the plant, stroking one of the broad leaves with his fingers. Angelica needed space. It didn't like to be crowded or fussed over. It grew best when left to its own quiet corner, far from noise. Edric understood that well. In the afternoon, a traveller passed through the village, a tinker with a bent back and a cart full of wares. He stopped at Edric's gate, asking if there was need of sharpening or mending. Edric invited him to sit a while and share a meal. Hilda brought out thick slices of barley bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and a small pot of lentils cooked with leek and chervil. As they ate beneath the bare-limbed apple tree, the tinker remarked on the scent of the herbs. "Not many folk grow chervil anymore," he said. "Too fickle, bolts too quick." Edric nodded. "It does, but if you catch it early before the heat, it's worth the trouble." The tinker smiled, chewing slowly. "You've got the garden of a man who remembers." Edric didn't answer. He only looked out over the rows, messy, uneven, full of old varieties, vegetables no one wrote poems about. But each one held a story, and each story rooted deeper than the one before. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows over the land, Edric walked the tinker to the lane and bid him safe travels. He stood for a while, watching the man's cart disappear over the rise, the faint jingle of pots and tools fading into the quiet. He returned to the garden and placed the freshly dug burdock root on the stone table near the door. It would be scrubbed, sliced, simmered, and served. But for now, it rested in the open air, the damp soil still clinging to its skin like a memory. The light softened, the wind changed. Somewhere far off a blackbird sang, and in the deep beds of Edric's garden, ancient vegetables half remembered and wholly alive waited their turn to rise. A low fog rolled in the next morning, clinging to the ground like a dream not ready to let go. It softened every shape, turned every tree into a smudge, and hushed the waking world. Adric stood on the stone threshold, the door creaking behind him as he stepped into the pale stillness. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and the garden lay just beyond, veiled and waiting. He moved through the rows as one might walk through a chapel, each step deliberate, each breath long and steady. The world was quiet here. No cartwheels, no distant voices, only the muffled rustle of leaves and the soft dripping of last night's dew. The garden in this hour belonged to him alone. Today he would tend to the bedstraw. It grew low, with fine, sticky stems and tiny white flowers that smelled faintly of hay when dried. Most dismissed it as a weed, Hilda dried the blossoms and tucked them into linen sachets to freshen the bedding. Some said it eased sleep, others that it repelled pests, but Adric simply liked its honesty. It asked for nothing, thrived in forgotten corners, and returned each year uninvited. He knelt by the patch beneath the hazel trees and ran his fingers through the bedstraw. It clung to his skin like a child, refusing to let go. He smiled, gathered a small bundle and laid it in his satchel. He would hang it above the children's beds later, tied with a bit of blue thread. Beyond the bedstraw was the fennel, tall, feathery and fragrant. Its stalks swayed in the faint breeze, though no wind could be seen. Fennel had a sweetness that cut through fatty meat, and its seeds were used in everything from bread to stomach tonics. Edric kept a bundle hanging near the hearth to scent the room, and another by the door as a charm. Not against spirits, he was no superstitious man, but against forgetting. Smells held memory, and fennel smelled of midsummer, of roast pork, of evenings when the world lingered in light just a bit longer. He checked the young fennel shoots, inspecting for frost damage. A few had withered at the tips, but most stood firm. He trimmed back the worst, mulched the base, and whispered a few soft words of encouragement. Not for the plant, but for himself. In a world ruled by seasons, patience wasn't a virtue. It was a necessity. In the shed, he opened a small wooden drawer built into the back wall. Inside were his bundles of dried roots and herbs, meadowsweet, comfrey, wild thyme. Some were for medicine, others for flavour, and a few simply for tradition. Today, he reached for the dried roots of elecampane, a tall plant with golden flowers and a bitter medicinal heart. Elecampane was not grown by many anymore. It took up space and grew best when ignored. But its roots, when sliced and boiled with honey, made a syrup for coughs and fevers. It had helped Toma through a rough winter 2 years back, when the cold had settled into his chest and stayed there. Since then, Edric had always kept a few roots drying. He ground a portion of the root into a rough powder with his mortar and pestle. The smell was sharp, earthy with a sweetness underneath. Hilda would mix it with warmed honey later and keep it in a sealed jar near the hearth. As he worked, he heard the soft padding of footsteps and turned to find Aelith at the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight around her small shoulders. "Da," she said, "the sorrel's growing faster than the others. Why?" He motioned for her to sit beside him. She did, her hands tucked into her sleeves. "Because sorrel's stubborn," he said. "It doesn't mind the cold. It wants to be first." Aelith nodded, considering that. "Like the birds," she said, "that come before the frost's gone." Just like that. He handed her a sliver of dried elecampane. She sniffed it and made a face. "It smells like old boots." He laughed quietly. "Yes, but it'll keep your brother from coughing next time." Together, they sat for a while in the hush of the shed, surrounded by the smell of herbs and dust and slow work. Aelith examined each bundle in the drawer, asking names and uses, tracing the shapes of leaves with her finger. Adric told her stories as he always did, where each plant came from, who had taught him and who taught them before. Some stories were real, passed down through generations. Others had no beginning. They simply existed, like wind through trees. As afternoon light filtered through the cracks in the walls, Edric rose and returned to the garden. He worked through the rows of early greens, endive, miner's lettuce, winter purslane. These were quick growers, eager to appear, eager to feed. Their names were mostly forgotten by the village, replaced by terms from market stalls and travelling peddlers. But Adric remembered. Endive was slightly bitter, with frilled leaves that caught the morning dew like lace. Miner's lettuce, round and soft, carried a fresh, clean taste. Winter purslane, also called Claytonia, was crisp, almost watery, perfect for refreshing the tongue after a day of salted meat and root stew. He picked a few handfuls of each, wrapped them in damp cloth, and brought them into the house. Hilda laid them out on a wooden board and began chopping them with the rhythm of long habit. The knife made a soft tapping sound, blending with the crackle of the hearth. That night, they ate a warm broth of barley, onion, and dried peas, topped with a handful of fresh greens. The children scrunched their noses at the bitterness, but ate nonetheless. After supper, they lay before the fire, heads resting on folded arms, listening to Hilda sing a song her mother had taught her, a lullaby about a garden that bloomed beneath the moon. Adric sat in his chair, polishing the wooden handles of his tools. He didn't need to. It was a quiet task, something to keep his hands busy while his thoughts drifted. He looked out the small window, where the garden lay shrouded in evening mist. He thought about the fennel, the bedstraw, the miner's lettuce, about the sorrel that grew first, the burdock that rooted deep, the elecampane that healed quietly without thanks. These were not just plants. They were reminders of old ways, of quiet strength, of things that grew in silence and gave without fanfare. And in that quiet, Edric felt the slow turn of time, like the steady swing of a gate left to the wind. Not rushed, not lost, just moving forward, one season at a time. The wind shifted by dawn. It no longer carried the soft, damp breath of spring, but a dry, whispering chill from the north. It rustled through the hedgerows like a cautious messenger, rattling the bones of the bare trees and lifting the edge of Edric's cloak as he crossed the yard. The sky above was a quiet grey, neither threatening rain nor promising sun, only hovering in that in-between space that often came before a new chapter in the season. He made his way toward the herb spiral near the southern side of the garden, where the stones still held warmth from the last stretch of sunlight days ago. This spiral had been Hilda's idea, a winding path of rocks and raised beds, arranged in a slow coil, each layer a little higher than the last. It held the herbs that needed more light and drier soil near the top, and those that liked the cooler shade nestled near the bottom. It wasn't ancient, not like the plots passed down through his family, but it had grown dear to him all the same. Today he would tend to the marjoram and savoury, the two herbs that had survived the winter wrapped in straw and shielded by the curve of the spiral. Their stems were browned at the tips, but life still clung to the base. He crouched low, humming softly, trimming away the dead growth with a small curved knife. Each cut released a scent that drifted on the breeze, sharp, green, and clean. Marjoram had a sweetness that lingered at the back of the tongue, a gentle warmth that softened the edge of lentils and beans. Savoury, as its name foretold, gave bite to dull roots, lifting them from simple to memorable. These herbs were more than flavour. They were medicine, memory, and protection. Tied in bundles above doors, they were said to keep sickness at bay. Sprinkled into hot broth, they soothed bellyaches and warded off the cold. He worked slowly, whispering the names as he went, not just for himself, but so the soil would remember. Names were powerful things, and if forgotten, the plants had a way of slipping away as well. By the time the herb spiral was clean and mulched, the village bell had rung twice, mid-morning. Edric straightened his back, hands sore and blackened from earth, and stood for a while watching the clouds pass low over the fields beyond. He could see his neighbour's smoke rising, thin and white, from across the hedgerows, and the clucking of hens drifted faintly over the wind. He decided to visit the far end of the garden where the nettles grew. They had begun to reappear in the past few days, green and proud, leaves soft enough still to touch without gloves. Nettles were always misunderstood, seen only as a sting, a weed, a nuisance. But they were among the first greens of spring, packed with strength, offering iron and warmth to those worn thin by winter. Edric picked carefully, gathering only the youngest tops and tucking them into his basket. Hilda would blanch them quickly to take the sting away, then chop them fine and stir them into oat porridge or spread them with curds on rye bread. The children would frown, of course, but still eat, their lips tingling just a little from the memory of the nettle's bite. Near the nettles grew a lesser-known plant called good hedge mustard, its thin leaves sharp and tangy, a wild cousin of the brassicas. Edric had discovered it by accident years ago, growing at the base of a boundary stone where the goats refused to graze. Its taste reminded him of cress, but stronger, a burst of brightness in the mouth. He let it grow freely, only cutting what was needed. He took a few stems now and added them to the basket. Then he moved on to the roots of bistort, growing by the stream, their snake-like curve hidden beneath soft loam. These were rich and starchy, boiled into gruel or pounded into flour. Old folk claimed bistort kept one strong through lean months. His grandmother had called it Passover root, though Edric never knew why. He only knew that she swore by it, and that was enough. As he dug, he unearthed a beetle the size of his thumb, shiny and slow. He held it for a moment, studying the way it moved across his palm, then placed it back on the damp soil unharmed. All creatures had their purpose here, even the smallest. He covered the hole with care and stood once more. The sky had lightened somewhat. A pale sun broke through the clouds in ribbons, warming the tops of the trees and casting a soft glow over the rows of young plants. Edric walked back toward the house, the weight of the basket balanced against his hip, the scent of herbs and soil following in his wake. Inside, Hilda was preparing broth, bones simmering, steam curling up to the rafters, mingling with the scent of leeks and thyme. She looked up as he entered and nodded toward the hearth, where a loaf of oat bread cooled on a cloth. "Any trouble?" she asked. "None worth naming," he replied. He handed her the herbs and greens. She sorted them quickly, her fingers practiced and precise. Within minutes, the nettles were in the pot, the savoury tucked into a small jar, and the hedge mustard set aside for the next day's meal. As the day waned, Adric returned outside with Toma trailing behind. The boy liked to watch the bees. They had begun to stir again, rising slowly from the hive beneath the plum tree, drifting on lazy loops toward the early blossoms. Together they sat in the grass, watching the bees move from flower to flower, their legs dusted with gold. "Will the bees find the marjoram?" Toma asked. "In time," Adric said. "They know the way." Toma nodded and lay back in the grass, eyes half closed. The hum of bees blended with the rustling of the trees, with the faint bubbling of the stream, with the slow breath of the garden as it settled into the rhythm of growth once more. Adric sat beside him, hands resting on his knees, eyes on the rows he had walked that morning. Rows filled with old names and older roots, vegetables that had waited patiently through the ages to be remembered. And in that stillness, in that warm silence shared between man and boy, he felt once again the deep, steady heartbeat of the land, unseen but always there. By the time the first swallows returned, tracing arcs through the morning sky, Edric knew the season had turned for good. The days were lengthening, and the chill that once lingered in the soil had been replaced by a gentle warmth that crept into every corner of the garden. Trees budded with soft green, the stream ran quicker, and the ducks along its banks quacked louder, as if aware of their own renewal. It was in this quiet shift of the season that Edric turned his attention to the climbing vegetables, those that needed trellises, stakes, or branches to rise into the air. These were not the proud kings of the root cellar, nor the lush-leafed greens of early spring. No, these were the patient ones, the twining vines, the curling stems, the soft climbers that reached skyward not with strength, but with persistence. He began by checking the old hazel stakes he'd stored behind the barn, bound with twine and stacked under a sloping roof to stay dry. They smelled of smoke and earth, and many were stained with green from previous years. Edric ran his fingers along the smooth shafts, testing for cracks. Most were sound, though a few had warped. He selected the best and carried them over his shoulder to the far edge of the garden. Here he had prepared 3 rows, each framed by a trench and mounded soil. It was where he would sow the climbing beans. Not the large, broad beans of spring, but the slender, winding types that came later, the crooked-necked pole beans, the speckled fire tongs, and the deep violet scarlet runners. These were not common in the village anymore. Most folk preferred short bush beans now, easier to tend and quicker to harvest. But Adric loved the old climbers. They told stories with their tendrils. They sang in the wind. He placed the hazel poles deep into the soil, setting them in a wide teepee at each row, then wove willow withies between them, making a lattice of sorts. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. The plants would find their way. They always did. From a small linen pouch he poured the seeds into his palm. They were beautiful things, each one different. Some black as coal, others marbled like bone and blood. He paused for a moment, admiring them. Each seed was a piece of history, carried through generations, touched by hands long gone. Some of these had come from his grandfather's garden, others from a passing friar who'd stopped for rest 10 summers ago. Edric had always saved the most vigorous pods, drying them carefully in a cloth bag hung near the hearth. He sowed them deep, pressing them gently into the warm soil, covering them with care. As he moved down the row, he whispered their names. Tangled Runner, Monk's Tooth, Red Tongue. The names were old and strange, some perhaps misremembered, others invented along the way. But he believed in naming. It kept things alive. Just beyond the beans, A few scattered plants of skirret had re-emerged, having overwintered well. He left them be, simply clearing away the encroaching weeds. Their white flower stalks would come in summer, tall and delicate, and the roots beneath would grow sweeter in the shadow of the beans. Near the western fence, he checked the hops. They grew wild now, winding up the old gateposts, spilling over the hedgerow. No one in the village brewed as they used to, and the hops were mostly ignored, but Edric let them stay. Their scent reminded him of long autumn evenings and stories told over mugs of warm ale. Hilda used the dried cones to stuff sleep pillows and sometimes brewed a mild tea to ease coughing. He gathered a few sprigs to hang in the shed, just as his mother had done. As the sun climbed, so did the heat, and Edric paused beneath the plum tree to rest. Its blossoms had begun to open, delicate and white, trembling in the breeze. Bees buzzed lazily among them, their legs already heavy with pollen. He watched them with a quiet reverence. They moved without hesitation, knowing their purpose, drawn by scent and colour. In his satchel he carried a few more seeds, gathered from vegetables that most had forgotten entirely. One was lablab, sometimes called hyacinth bean. Its flowers were deep purple, its pods iridescent. He'd only grown it once, years ago, after trading for a handful of seeds from a merchant passing through with cloth and trinkets. It was a fickle plant, needing warmth and patience, but he had never stopped thinking of its beauty. He planted a few at the base of the garden wall, near the south-facing stones where the sun lingered longest. He didn't know if they would thrive this year, but he planted them anyway. Some things were worth trying, even if they failed. He sowed cucumbers too, not the smooth-skinned ones found in markets, but the old ridge cucumbers, their skins bristled and rough, their flesh sharp with flavour. These would twine along the trellis he'd built beside the rain barrel, reaching out with curious arms, gripping the lattice as they climbed. When the work was done, Adric stood back and looked at the rows, at the stakes and string and seeds tucked into the earth. It looked simple, perhaps even unimpressive to an outsider. Just soil and sticks. But to him it was a cathedral, a place of hope built with hands and memory. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees and the shadows stretched across the path, Adric sat on the threshold once more. He held a cup of broth in his hands, its warmth rising into the air like breath, and watched the garden in the fading light. Hilda joined him, a woolen shawl around her shoulders, her hair braided back. She said nothing, only sat beside him and followed his gaze. "Did you sow the red runners?" she asked after a while. He nodded. "And the lablab?" "Aye," he said softly. "We'll see." The quiet settled again, not heavy, not uncertain, but full, the kind of silence that needed no filling, and in the garden beneath the soil the seeds rested, waiting, listening, ready to climb. Morning broke soft and gold, spilling light across the windowsill and warming the flagstones of the hearth. The air was still but full of scent, the kind of scent only found in the first real days of spring, when the earth, no longer chilled, begins to breathe upward. Adric opened the shutters with care, letting the breeze roll in. It carried a fragrance of moss, plum blossoms, and something older, perhaps the dust of pollen stirred from the long sleep of the trees. Today, his work would lead him beyond the cultivated plots, into the edge of the woodland behind his property. The forest had always been a quiet companion to his garden, offering things the tilled soil could not. It gave mushrooms in damp years, berries in late summer, and roots hidden beneath leaf litter that even the most experienced villagers often missed or mistook. But to Edric, those shadowed places held no mystery, only memory. He strapped on his worn boots, pulled a linen satchel across his shoulder, and took up his ashwood walking stick. The handle had been smoothed by years of use, its grain darkened where fingers had held it in thought and travel. Hilda handed him a small piece of oatcake wrapped in cloth, and with a nod he set off. The forest was still heavy with dew. Each leaf glistened, each blade of grass a tiny prism. The canopy had not yet filled in, so sunlight broke through in long, clean shafts that struck the underbrush and painted it with light. Edric walked a narrow path, one he had walked hundreds of times, yet which always felt slightly different with each season. His first stop was a shaded glade, where the ground dipped slightly and the soil remained moist year-round. Here, tucked beneath low branches and veils of ivy, grew sweet Sicily. The leaves were feathery, like fern, and when bruised, they gave off a scent that reminded him of anise and honey. It was one of the earliest herbs to appear in spring, long before others dared show their heads. Adric knelt beside a small clump, careful not to take too much. Sweet Sicily was used to soften the bitterness of other herbs in pottages. Hilda also used its roots, roasting them until they caramelized, their sweetness deepened and complex. But more than its use in food, it was a sign. Wherever Sicily grew, the soil was good, the balance was right. Nature's quiet confirmation. From there he made his way deeper, the path narrowing, the trees growing thicker. He passed under a cluster of hornbeams, their pale trunks like bones of ancient giants, and found what he had come for, the patch of wild garlic or ramsons that sprawled across the slope like a sea of green. The scent hit him before he even knelt, sharp, pungent and invigorating. The leaves shimmered slightly, damp from the morning's breath. Among them, white buds were beginning to form, tight fists of blossom that would soon explode into starbursts. Adric picked sparingly, knowing others, deer, badgers, birds, relied on this place too. He rolled the leaves gently and tucked them into his satchel. Later, they would be crushed into butter or stirred into barley, perhaps folded into eggs or laid raw upon fresh bread with soft cheese. Their flavour was fleeting, sharp like spring itself. He continued on, now headed toward a fallen oak whose trunk had hollowed in the centre. Beneath it, on the shaded side, he found a cluster of early wood sorrel. The leaves, shaped like hearts, trembled slightly as he approached. He picked just a few and tasted one on his tongue. The tartness danced there, clean and sour like a lemon plucked from memory. Sorrel had grown wild near his childhood home, in the marshy fields where sheep grazed. He remembered plucking it as a boy, chewing the leaves while lying in the grass, watching clouds drift like silent ships across the sky. It was a child's flavour, startling, simple, unforgettable. He sat a while near the oak, resting against the moss-soft bark. Around him, birds called through the trees. Thrushes, robins, a wren so small he could barely follow its movement. The wind shifted above, rattling the last of the winter's dead leaves. Somewhere nearby, a squirrel chattered indignantly. From his pouch, he unwrapped the oatcake and ate slowly, savouring the taste of grains and salt and honey. As he chewed, he thought of the things growing unseen, not just in the garden, but here, under root and stone, in places no plough would ever reach. These were the plants forgotten by books, kept alive only in kitchens and pockets, passed from hand to hand without fanfare. They did not wear the names of saints or kings. They were quiet, persistent, necessary. On his way back, he stopped beside a stream where the water flowed quick and cold. There, growing on a stone shelf just above the current, he saw it. Water pepper. Its narrow leaves and reddish stems were unmistakable. He had not seen it here since the last flood, years ago. He plucked a few leaves, careful to leave the roots, and smiled. It was a fiery little thing, hot on the tongue, almost metallic. But in the right stew, or infused in vinegar, it brought a brightness that nothing else could. Hilda would be pleased. When he returned to the garden, the sun had climbed higher and the mist was gone. The soil steamed faintly and bees flickered from flower to flower like gold dust in motion. He walked the rows slowly, depositing the leaves and herbs into a shallow basket near the kitchen door. Hilda was inside, peeling roots with a paring knife. She looked up, eyes bright. "From the woods?" she asked. He nodded. "Sweet Sicily, ramsons, sorrel, and something new." She smiled, understanding. He handed her the bundle and she breathed in the scent. "You always bring back something I've forgotten." "Not forgotten," he said, "just sleeping." She laid the leaves beside the chopping board and resumed her work, while Edric stepped back into the sunlight. The garden greeted him in its soft, steady way, rows pushing upward, vines curling, leaves unfolding. And somewhere beneath the surface, fed by rain and shadow, by memory and care, the past kept growing. Quietly, patiently as it always had. The days settled into their new rhythm, shaped by the unfolding of leaves and the slow swell of buds into blossom. In the hedgerows, the blackthorn was already beginning to fade, its white petals drifting like soft snow upon the earth. In its place, the hawthorn readied its bloom, green now but preparing, like everything in spring, for its moment of splendour. Edric woke early, before the birds had fully begun their song, drawn from sleep by the heaviness of the air. A faint mist clung to the fields, and the sky wore the soft hue of ash, hinting at rain to come. He pulled his cloak over his shoulders and stepped into his boots, worn at the toes, cracked at the soles, but still strong. The earth beneath was spongy with moisture, yielding with every step. Today was a day for tending the roots, not harvesting, but thinning, loosening, giving space. He made his way to the carrot beds first. Not the orange carrots that would one day dominate every plate, but the old ones, white, purple, even deep red. These had names that sounded strange to modern ears. Long red of Florence, white Belgian, dragon's root. Some twisted as they grew, gnarled like fingers, others stretched straight and true. Edric knelt and brushed back the mulch, fingers finding the tops of the seedlings. Many had sprouted too close, as they often did. The thinning was necessary, painful perhaps, but kind. Without it, none would thrive. He plucked the weaker shoots gently, setting them aside in a cloth-lined bowl. They would not go to waste. Hilda would toss them with oil and vinegar, or stew them lightly with herbs. Even the smallest green carried value here. Beside the carrots grew the parsnips, already establishing their strong taproots beneath the soil. Their feathery tops trembled in the morning breeze. Edric left them mostly alone, only removing a few invaders, dock, chickweed, and a persistent creeping buttercup. His knife worked quietly through the soil, cutting where needed, sparing where possible. He paused now and then to listen. The crows were awake now, calling from the trees, and a lark rose somewhere over the field, its cry thin and bright. The wind had shifted to the west, carrying with it the scent of far-off rain and perhaps the breath of the sea, though they were many miles inland. By mid-morning the light had softened, and clouds gathered above, heavy-bellied and slow. Edric moved next to the salsify, a favourite of his, long slender roots with flesh like cream and a flavour both earthy and floral. He kept them under straw, their growing tips just visible, pale green and almost shy. They were not as quick as other roots. They needed time, deep soil and quiet, but they were worth it. He cleared the weeds gently and checked for signs of pest or rot. All was well. In a few months, their delicate purple flowers would bloom, drawing bees and curious stares alike. For now, they rested, unseen. Back at the house, Hilda was preparing a midday meal. The hearth was warm, and the scent of barley and wild herbs drifted out the open window. Edric set his bowl of thin seedlings on the table just inside, and Hilda glanced up. "These'll make a good salad," she said. He nodded. "Carrots are thick this year." "They know the soil's kind," she replied, and set to washing them. After the meal, Edric sat for a while in the doorway, sharpening his hoe with slow practiced strokes. The rasp of stone against iron echoed softly across the yard. The rain came as expected, not with fury, but in long, steady curtains that softened the edges of the world. The garden drank deeply. When the rain lightened, he returned outside and made his way to the onion bed. These were not just ordinary onions, but ancient varieties. Tree onions, also called walking onions, with clusters of small bulbs that grew at the top of the stem and eventually tipped over, planting themselves anew. They marched slowly across the garden, year by year, like a quiet army. He gathered a few of the bulbils and placed them in a small pouch. Aelith would help him replant them tomorrow along the fence line, where they would continue their wandering, independent and enduring. Next to the onions grew scorzonera, black-skinned and long. It was often confused with salsify, but the two were different, cousins perhaps. Edric left these alone today. They were slow-growing and liked to be forgotten. Disturbing them too early led to split roots and bitterness. As the clouds thinned in the late afternoon, the garden glistened. Every leaf wore a coat of water, every stone darkened with damp. He walked the rows once more, not to work, but to observe. The beans had begun their slow climb up the hazel poles. The lettuces were spreading, their hearts beginning to form. The gooseberry bush near the edge of the path was heavy with green fruit, still hard but full of promise. And along the back wall, where a patch of wild violets had taken root, he found a surprise, a single blooming bloom of borage, bright blue and star-shaped. It hadn't been planted this year. It had simply returned. Edric knelt beside it, touched the flower gently with a calloused finger. Borage had long been a friend to the garden, its flowers edible, its leaves cooling. The bees adored it. His mother used to say borage gave courage, though he had never been certain how. Still, he let it grow wherever it pleased. He stood, rain still dripping from the leaves above, and felt the fullness of the day settle into his bones. His work had not been grand, no crops hauled in, no fields turned, but it was work that mattered, thinning, watching, tending. The kind of work that couldn't be rushed, the kind that tied a man to his land like roots beneath the surface, unseen and strong. As twilight crept in and the frogs began their quiet chorus by the stream, Edric lit the lantern by the door and sat for a while in the hush of evening. The garden, washed clean, exhaled a rich scent of soil and leaf and stone. And within it, nestled deep and steady, grew the old vegetables. The ones time had forgotten, but that he remembered. By the time mid-spring unfurled its full breath across the land, the garden had shifted once again. The early green had deepened, the soft sprouts had become sturdier, and the air was filled with the murmur of bees and the rustle of leaves stirred by a warm westward wind. The soil, once slick with frost and clinging cold, was now loamy and sweet, breathing a scent that was unmistakably alive. Edric rose, just as the first light slipped over the horizon, staining the thatch rooftops with gold. Birds stirred in the hedgerows, their calls crisscrossing the quiet morning in layers. Dove, thrush, blackcap, and the wren that lived in the beam above the barn door. He stepped into the garden with a slow breath, his boots pressing softly into the path's edges where violets bloomed. This morning's work would take him to the lesser patch, a shaded bed near the old orchard where the soil was cooler and slower to wake. Here, beneath the dappled light of gnarled plum trees, he grew the vegetables that preferred the shade. Not weaklings, no, but quiet ones. They did not rise tall and shout their presence, but crept and curled and hummed softly under the canopy. At the centre of this patch, growing in a loose ring, were the cowpeas. These weren't the neat garden peas grown in straight rows, but a wild-blooded cousin with black markings on their shells and a creeping habit that tangled over anything in its way. Their vines clung to low sticks he had planted months ago, and the first delicate flowers had just begun to appear. Pale violet, almost ghostly in the morning light. Edric crouched and pinched away a few side shoots to direct their energy upward. He spoke to them under his breath, nonsense syllables mostly, but soft, coaxing. He believed they responded to tone, if not to words, and more than that, he liked the feel of speech in the garden. It filled the spaces between breeze and bird call, made the work feel known. Beside the cowpeas he had planted Hamburg parsley, grown for its thick roots rather than its leaves, though the greens were useful too. Most forgot about this vegetable. It wasn't showy. Its flavour was somewhere between celery and parsnip, its shape rough, tapering like an old candle. But it was dependable. Edric scratched gently at the base of one plant, feeling the swelling root beneath. It was coming along nicely. Not ready yet, but close. Further back, near the moss-covered stone wall, grew skirret, his old favourite. Though he'd planted a row in the main beds, this second patch had been left to naturalise. Some stalks were already waist-high, and in their shade grew chickweed and wood sorrel, mingling like friendly guests at a table. He let them be. He turned next to the chard, bright stems in red, gold and white. They gleamed like stained glass under the morning sun. The leaves were thick and crinkled, full of iron and life. Hilda used them in pies and soups, but Edric sometimes chewed them raw, especially the young leaves, which snapped with a clean, vegetal tang. Aelith appeared soon after, her hair still tousled from sleep, her hands full of wooden bowls. "Mama says we'll make hand pies today," she said, "if you bring her the chard and the greens." Edric nodded. He handed her a bundle of chard, then reached for the good sorrel, leaves like arrowheads, deep green veined with crimson. She held the bowl as he filled it. "Why do we grow so many things other people don't?" she asked after a while. "Gerd's garden has only cabbage and onions." He paused. "Because these," he said, gesturing to the patch around them, "are the ones that remember us." She frowned. "Plants don't remember." "Don't they?" he replied with a smile. "These were grown by your grandmother's grandmother. Each season, each seed passed along. They grow because we do, because we don't forget them." Aelith considered that, nodding slowly. Then, satisfied with the answer for now, she carried the greens back to the house. Later, as the sun climbed higher and the garden filled with the hum of the bees' midday work, Edric turned his attention to the lovage. It stood tall by the corner of the shed door, its scent sharp as celery and lemon. He trimmed a few stalks and bundled them for drying. Lovage had many uses, in broths, in herb salts, in teas for those with a nervous stomach. But to Eadric, it also held a kind of authority in the garden. Its height, its vigour, it seemed to anchor things. As he worked, he caught sight of something small and blue in the grass, a tiny flax blossom. He hadn't sown flax this year, but it had returned on its own, likely from seed dropped last harvest. Its flower was soft, 5-petaled, and as blue as a summer sky. He bent low to admire it. Flax was once more common, grown for its seeds and fibres alike. Now it was rare, displaced by things quicker to grow and easier to process. But here it was welcome. At the far end of the garden, he had allowed a few wild radish plants to flower. Their pale purple petals shimmered in the light. They were not as mild as the cultivated types. Their roots were tougher, their flavour more biting. But their flowers drew pollinators, and their seed pods, green and crisp, were a secret treat when pickled. The clouds began to gather in the late afternoon, not thick or angry, just enough to soften the light and cool the air. Eadric sat under the plum tree, a small jar of pickled mustard greens in his lap, a crust of bread in his hand. He ate slowly, savouring each bite, each crackle of sour and spice. He watched the breeze move through the fennel and the dill, their tall stems dancing, their shadows thin and long. Everything was in motion now, not hurried but sure. The season had fully turned, and with it, the garden had become a quiet storm of life, each plant pushing upward, outward, onward. And in that movement, that gentle chaos, Eadric felt a stillness, not of emptiness, but of peace. The peace that came from knowing the names of things, from remembering them, from growing what others no longer did, and letting those forgotten vegetables take root once more, under a sky that still listened. By the time the moon waxed full again, casting its milky glow across the garden paths, the long daylight hours had begun to stitch the season together in golden threads. Each morning, Eadric rose to a garden more alive than the day before. Where once there had been silence and still soil, now there were murmurs, soft rustlings of leaves, the drone of bees, and the occasional creak of bean vines gripping their trellises tighter with each passing hour. It was the kind of spring that came only after a long, bitter winter, not hurried, not loud, but rich with depth. A spring that made things linger, flavours, scents, memories. Eadric could feel it in his bones, the way one feels the approach of rain or the stirring of birds before dawn. And on this particular morning, he woke with one thought. It was time to visit the orchard. The orchard lay beyond the garden's rear gate, past the low stone wall and a patch of tall grass that Hilda allowed to grow wild each year. It wasn't large, no more than a dozen trees, but it held within it a kind of sacred quiet. Each tree was old, some older than Eadric himself, their trunks gnarled, their bark crusted with moss and lichen. But each year, without fail, they flowered, and each year they bore fruit. He crossed the threshold as the sun broke through the thinning clouds, slanting in wide amber rays through the leaves. The grass beneath his boots was thick and wet, heavy with dew. The orchard shimmered. The apple trees had just begun to blossom, their branches heavy with soft pink and white petals. The air was thick with their perfume, sweet, heady, and touched with something faintly bitter. Beneath one of the oldest trees, a belle angevine whose fruit ripened late into autumn, Eadric stopped and pressed his hand against the bark. These trees had been part of the garden's rhythm long before him. His father had grafted them from cuttings given by a monk who once passed through. Some bore strange fruits, misshapen, oddly coloured, even mottled. Others were sharp on the tongue, better for drying than eating, but all were treasured. They were not showy, not market fare, but they were real, honest, alive. He turned to inspect the undergrowth at their roots. Beneath the trees, tucked into shade and fed by the mulch of years, grew a second garden, a hidden one. Comfrey first, its wide, rough leaves and purple flower bells nodding heavily. Comfrey was a healer. Hilda made poultices from its roots for bruises and sprains, mixing it with honey and wax to draw out the ache from joints. It grew wild here, uninvited but welcome. Nearby, he spotted the first curling shoots of wild asparagus. It grew differently from the cultivated sort, thinner, almost wiry, with a wilder scent when broken. Eadric plucked 3 spears, thin as rushes, and slipped them into his pouch. Around the base of another tree, the ground was carpeted with ground elder. To many it was a weed, a scourge impossible to remove. But to Adric, it was another old food, one that had once fed monks and peasants alike in hungry springs. Its young leaves tasted of parsley and celery, and when cooked gently softened into something buttery and bright. He knelt, gathering a few handfuls, choosing only the tender tops. He'd sauté them tonight with duck fat and a touch of vinegar, perhaps fold them into a rough pastry crust with egg and onion. Moving from tree to tree, he checked each one with care, noting the spread of leaves, the tightness of the blossoms, the sway of the limbs. He trimmed deadwood where needed, using his knife with the patience of habit, and whispered his thanks to each trunk as he passed. Near the far end of the orchard, he found a patch of sorrel grown so dense it looked like a green tide. The sharp, lemony leaves trembled in the breeze, casting shifting shadows. Adric picked a few to chew, savouring their tang as he walked. They cleared the mouth, woke the senses. Then, beneath the spreading shade of the old pear tree, he paused. There, hidden in the ivy, bloomed a forgotten relic, a cluster of tansy. It had not shown its face in 2 years. Its fern-like leaves and small button-yellow flowers stood defiantly against the shadow. Hilda used it sparingly. Its flavour was strong, bitter, pungent. But in small doses it added something haunting to baked custards or cured meat. He gathered just one flower head and one small bunch of leaves. No more. Tansy was not a friend to overuse. As he walked back toward the garden, pouch now full of greens and herbs, he thought again of the things that grew where no one planted them. The volunteers, the wilds, the wanderers. These plants thrived in the shadows of larger things, beneath trees, beside walls, among stones. They did not boast, but they endured. Back inside the garden gate, the light had shifted. It filtered down through the broad leaves of the cardoon and the tall spears of the overwintered kale, dappling the path with warmth. Hilda stood near the kitchen door, a mixing bowl in her arms, the scent of baking reaching even the orchard's edge. Edric handed her the pouch, and together they began sorting its contents on the table near the window. Ground elder to be blanched, sorrel to be chopped, tansy to be hung and dried. The asparagus would be eaten fresh, barely cooked, sprinkled with salt. As she worked, Hilda asked gently, "Do you think others still grow these things?" "Not many," Edric replied, peeling back the edge of a sorrel leaf. "But some, somewhere." She nodded, satisfied. "It's enough." And as the afternoon passed, the sky dimmed, and the garden hummed with that low, continuous song of growing things. Edric sat quietly beneath the pear tree, watching the shadows grow long. The orchard, the garden, the green in between. They were not separate. They were the same hymn, sung in different voices. And in each forgotten root and remembered leaf, he heard the melody, steady and low, carrying the old world forward. The next morning began with soft thunder murmuring over the hills. It wasn't the angry sort that split the sky and sent animals running. It was the kind that rolled gently through the clouds, like the low hum of a distant drum. The air felt heavy and close, and the light that filtered through the windows was tinged faintly with gold, as though the sun itself had been muted by sleep. Adric knew rain was coming, but not yet. There was time, and that time, however brief, belonged to the soil. He stepped into the garden barefoot, his boots slung over his shoulder, wanting to feel the earth under him. The ground was warm and damp, still remembering yesterday's sun. Between the rows, small tufts of moss curled near the edges, and insects darted from blade to blade, their wings glinting like fragments of glass. His task today would be in the back beds, where he had planted his greens that needed succession sowing. These were the vegetables that came quickly and needed frequent renewal. They didn't wait. They lived in bursts, short, vibrant lives. Cress, lamb's lettuce, mustard greens, arugula. He began with the arugula, known then as rocket. It had come long ago from across the sea, with soldiers or monks or traders, no one quite remembered. Its name changed with each tongue, but its bite remained the same. The leaves, tender and deeply lobed, had matured swiftly. Edric plucked the older ones first, letting the younger ones remain. The scent that rose from them was spicy, almost peppery, and stayed on the fingers long after the harvest. Next came the lamb's lettuce, also called corn salad or mush by those who spoke differently. It grew in tidy rosettes, each cluster like a handful of green petals. It was softer on the tongue, more delicate than the others, and perfect for early meals. Edric picked it with care, cradling the leaves in his palm so as not to crush them. Then came the mustard greens. These were lively, eager plants, their jagged leaves full of fire. Even the smallest bite could bring tears to the eyes if eaten raw. But when wilted or stirred into broth, their heat mellowed into warmth, deep and fragrant. He harvested a few handfuls, leaving room for the second sowing he would make before the rain came. Finally, he reached the cress. Watercress he grew near the stream, but here he had planted land cress, a smaller cousin, with a flavour just as bright. It nestled low to the ground, easily lost among faster growers, but Edric always made space for it. It reminded him of the simpler meals, bread, cheese, cress, and a cup of broth. With the harvest complete, he began sowing again, drawing his finger through the soil in careful lines, dropping the seeds one by one. They were small, nearly weightless, but each held a whisper of tomorrow. He covered them gently, patted the earth with his palm, and stood back, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked up and saw Hilda at the kitchen window, her hair wrapped in a cloth, a wooden spoon in her hand. She nodded toward the rising clouds. "Won't be long now," she called. "No," Edric answered. "I'll finish by midday." He turned then to the nearby beds where the spinach had taken root. This was a later sowing, but the plants were vigorous, the leaves already thick and dark. He crouched to inspect for signs of bolting, an early stretch toward flowering that would spoil the taste. But the cool nights had kept it in check. From beneath the spinach canopy, he picked a few snails and placed them gently under the comfrey near the fence. They belonged in the garden too, but not among the spinach. As he moved to the herb rows, a breeze picked up, lifting the scent of coriander and chive flowers. The coriander had bolted, sending up tall stalks topped with delicate white blossoms. Most would see it as a failure, but Edric did not. The flowers brought the bees, and the seeds, when dried, were valuable in pickling and bread. He would let them bloom. The chives, too, were in flower, round purple heads that bobbed in the wind. Their sharp oniony scent mingled with the sweetness of the other herbs, creating a perfume that only a garden at its height could make. He snipped a few blossoms, set them aside for vinegar infusions, then turned to the sorrel patch. The sorrel had grown wild this year, perhaps more than he needed, but its taste never grew old to him. He picked a basket's worth and sat on the low stone wall, trimming the stems with a small knife. The clouds above had grown denser, and the first scent of rain, clean, cold, inevitable, began to fall from the sky like a promise. Back inside, Hilda had already laid a cloth on the table. Aelith was slicing boiled eggs and Toma was shelling peas with slow, deliberate fingers. They would make a salad, Edric thought, one that tasted of spring's middle note, bitter, sharp and green. He laid the arugula and lamb's lettuce on the cloth, then the mustard and sorrel. The greens mixed together like a patchwork of fields seen from above. He watched for a moment, content. The first raindrops came as they sat to eat, fat, slow drops that tapped the thatch and beaded on the windows. The sky had turned pewter, and the garden shimmered beneath it, welcoming the water like a long-lost friend. As they ate, they spoke little. The food was fresh, and their mouths were busy. But Edric watched his children chewing thoughtfully, tasting flavours sharp and unfamiliar, and smiled. Later, when the rain grew stronger, he stood beneath the eaves and looked out over the garden. The soil darkened. The leaves danced, and the rows he'd sown that morning glistened like ink drawn across parchment. It was a garden of old greens, of quick lives, of second sowings. And in the soft murmur of the falling rain, Edric felt the quiet satisfaction of things done rightly, and in their own time. The rain fell through the night with an even, unhurried rhythm, soaking the fields, rinsing dust from the leaves and filling every vessel and hollow with its music. By morning, the garden was transformed again, washed clean, edges softened, scents deepened. Every blade of grass bowed under the weight of droplets, and the soil had grown dark and pliant, ready for what would come next. Edric stepped out before first light, the world still blue and shadowed. He paused on the threshold, breathing in the scent of wet earth, and something more subtle, life rising. A soft mist floated across the garden's lowest beds, and birds were only just beginning to stir in the hedgerow, their calls hesitant but hopeful. Today was a day for tending the brassicas. He walked the narrow path between the rows, where rain had pooled into shallow puddles, reflecting the sky above. The cabbages stood like sentinels, broad leaves outstretched, beads of water glinting like glass along their ribs. These were not the tightly packed green globes seen on market carts. His were loose-headed and crinkled, Savoy and Jerry King, the kind that could withstand frost and lean soil and still offer nourishment. He crouched beside the first plant, brushing back the outer leaves. The inner ones, pale and tender, curled inward like a secret kept. He inspected each for signs of slug or rot. The rain could bring life, but it also brought trouble. Damp invited all manner of soft decay. Satisfied, he moved on, checking the kales next. They had grown tall and wild, their stalks thick, their leaves sprawling like open hands. Purple-veined and curled, they looked like something from a storybook forest. Edric liked to pluck a few leaves early in the morning, when they were still cool and crisp, and eat them raw with a smear of mustard. Bitter, yes, but the bitterness had weight, a reminder that food was not always meant to be easy. Beyond the kale stood the collards, broad-leafed and flat, their colour deeper than the cabbages, almost blue. These were quiet survivors. They didn't bolt or fuss or draw the eye. They simply grew, dependable. They fed families when nothing else did, and asked for little in return. Further on, the purple-sprouting broccoli had begun to show its namesake, tight clusters of violet florets at the tips, framed by jagged leaves. This was an old crop, grown for centuries before the smoother-headed versions came into fashion. Its flavour was stronger, its growth slower, but it stood proud through cold and rain, growing even when snow dusted the fields. Adric reached to harvest a few heads, cutting them just above the second node to encourage more shoots. He tucked them into his linen bag, careful not to crush the tender stems. These would be steamed lightly, eaten with vinegar and a touch of egg. Simple fare, but filling. He moved next to the rutabagas, or as his grandmother had called them, neeps. A cross between turnip and cabbage, their leaves looked rough and unpromising, but beneath the surface the roots were swelling. He scratched at the soil near one, revealing a rounded top, purplish and yellow. Still a few weeks more. Then came the kohlrabi, standing like strange creatures on pale green legs. Their swollen stems bulged above ground, firm to the touch. He had always liked them, not just for their taste, but their oddness. They didn't pretend to be beautiful. They were alien, peculiar, and resilient. He harvested 2 and laid them gently beside the broccoli. Peeled and sliced, they were crisp and sweet like apple and radish mixed. As the sky began to lighten, Edric paused to stretch his back and took in the full view of the brassica patch. It was not neat. The rows curved with the land, and the plants grew at their own pace, some large, some stunted, some flowering early. But it was alive, and that was enough. Returning to the path, he passed the patch of wild mustard that had seeded itself near the fence. It had grown tall during the rains, its yellow flowers already beginning to open. The scent was sharp and promising. Hilda would gather the young seed pods later and brine them, tiny bursts of heat and vinegar. Near the wild mustard, a few stragglers of horseradish pushed their way through the sodden earth. Their leaves were long and coarse, but Edric knew the roots were where the fire lay. He wouldn't harvest them today. They grew better with time, sharpness deepened by neglect. Back in the house, the fire had already been lit, and the air smelled of rye flour and smoke. Hilda stood at the hearth, feeding a pot with onions and lard, her hair tied up with a strip of linen, her sleeves rolled. She looked over as Edric laid the broccoli and kohlrabi on the table. "Wet out?" she asked. "Wet enough," he replied, wringing out his cloak. Aelith came in next, carrying a small basket of eggs from the coop, still warm in the straw. She grinned when she saw the kohlrabi. "I'll make a pickle," she said, "with mustard seeds and cider." Edric nodded, pleased. She had learned more than he realized. As they worked together, washing, peeling, stirring, he thought of all the meals these brassicas had given over the years. Not grand ones, not feasts, but steady meals. Meals that held a family together through storms and snow and the thin weeks before harvest. And as the wind picked up outside, shaking droplets from the trees and sending them pattering onto the thatch, Edric felt a stillness settle in his chest. The cabbages, the kales, the collards, they were not glamorous things, but they were ancient, loyal, honest, Like the garden itself, they asked only to be tended, remembered, and allowed to grow. The next day dawned warm and windless, the sort of morning that seemed to hum with the quiet breath of the earth itself. Not a single branch stirred, and even the bees moved slowly as though reluctant to break the stillness. In this suspended silence, everything felt more vivid. The green of the leaves, the coolness of the soil, the rustle of a bird shifting its weight in a distant hedge. Edric rose early, his body heavy with sleep, but his hands already remembering the day's work. Today was for seeds, not sowing, but saving. The art of saving seed was older than memory, and for Edric it was sacred. He remembered watching his mother sit for hours by the fire, fingers deftly sorting pods and kernels into earthen jars, her lips moving silently as she counted or sang. It was not just work, it was preservation, ceremony, inheritance. He began in the far bed near the old willow tree, where last season's parsnips had been left to bolt. Their flower stalks now reached high above his waist, topped with flat clusters of yellow blooms, buzzing with insects. Most would be left for the bees, for the birds, for the wind, but a few stalks he had marked, tied with a bit of red thread near the base. These were for collecting. He touched the umbel of the first, its seeds already beginning to dry and darken. They were rough and ridged, with a faint scent like sweetened earth. Carefully he snipped the stalk and turned it upside down into a muslin sack. He tied it shut with twine and slung it over his shoulder, then moved on to the next. Further down the row stood coriander, already past its bloom. The delicate white flowers had given way to clusters of green seed, slowly turning brown. Some had already begun to drop, scattering on the soil below like forgotten coins. He knelt to gather a few with his fingers, rolling them in his palm. Their scent released instantly, bright, sharp and citrusy with a touch of spice. He left the rest to dry further on the stem, marking the spot with a smooth stone. Timing was everything with seed saving. Too early and they moulded, too late and the wind claimed them. Near the herb spiral, the dill had begun its slow ascent into seedhood. Umbels, like lace, spread toward the sky, delicate and feathery, but beneath that grace, Edric knew strength resided. The seeds of dill held medicine and flavour alike. Hilda used them in pickles, yes, but also in teas to ease stomachs and sometimes crushed into bread to remind them of summer in the coldest depths of winter. He worked quietly, letting the rhythm guide him, snip, shake, tie, hang. His satchels grew heavier with each pass, the scents blending, fennel, chervil, chive, lovage. Then he came to the peas. These were no longer green and soft, but dried to parchment on their vines, curled and rattling when shaken. The pods were leathery now, brittle. He plucked one and split it open, revealing a row of dark round seeds nestled inside. Each one was slightly different, some speckled, others striped, a few almost black. These were marrow-fat peas, passed from Wulfgar before his last winter. Edric had grown them carefully, not for food, but to keep the line alive. He placed them gently into a carved wooden bowl he'd made years ago, and for a moment he just looked at them, small, dry, unassuming. Yet each held within it a plant, a bloom, a harvest, a history. As the sun rose higher, a soft breeze began to stir. It rippled through the tall grasses, tugged at the seed heads, and sent pollen into the air like dust from a forgotten book. Adric stood and brushed the soil from his knees. He had more to gather. At the back of the garden, he found the first of the leeks gone to flower. Their tall stalks bore round blooms like faded fireworks, pale purple and buzzing with life. He selected a few, shaking them gently into a cloth. The seeds were small, black and angular, like flakes of slate. Near the compost heap, forgotten by most, grew a stand of orac, its red leaves now dulled and its seed heads beginning to crisp. Orac, that old relative of spinach, was rarely grown anymore. But here it flourished, year after year, having claimed its small patch of the garden like an heir to a quiet throne. Edric pinched a cluster between his fingers and crushed them lightly. The seeds released with little effort, scattering into the cloth like grains of sand. He smiled. It would grow again. By mid-afternoon, his hands were stained and fragrant, his back sore, his satchels full. He laid the sacks in the shade beneath the apple tree, spreading them slightly to allow air to pass through. The seeds would dry there until evening and then be moved inside, labelled, jarred, stored. Inside the house, Aelith had cleared the table and placed small bowls in neat rows. Adric began laying out the seeds, one type per bowl. She brought him strips of parchment and a small jar of ink. Together they wrote the names, slow and careful. Dragon's tongue bean, marrowfat pea, red auroch, bronze fennel, good King Henry, white parsnip. Each label was tied or tucked or pressed into the jar, and with each one the kitchen filled more and more with the scent of the future. Later, as the sky turned pale and the crickets began to chirp, Edric stepped back outside. He walked the garden once more, looking not for plants now, but for promise. Every dried flower, every forgotten corner, every pod rattling in the wind, it was all part of the same slow rhythm. Seeds didn't shout. They didn't bloom in glory or feed on admiration. They waited, patiently, silently, and when the time was right, they returned. And as he stood in that quiet dusk, listening to the soft whisper of seed heads in the breeze, Edric felt something old and steady move within him, an understanding as ancient as the soil beneath his feet. That saving a seed was not just keeping a plant, it was keeping a piece of the world alive. The morning after the seed harvest arrived with a change in the air. A coolness not of winter's bite, but of balance. Something settled, the garden now past its early hunger, moving toward fullness. The frantic rising of spring had softened into steady growth. Leaves were broader, roots deeper. The colour of everything, greens, reds, purples, was richer now, touched by sun and soil in equal measure. Edric stood in the doorway a long while before moving. The garden no longer asked for urgency. It invited attention, patience. It breathed. Today, he would visit the plants grown for more than their leaves or roots. Plants grown for their pods, their fruit, their promise. These were the legumes, the beans and peas that hung in quiet rows like stories not yet told. He made his way toward the trellis nearest the cottage wall, where the scarlet runners had begun their climb weeks ago. They were vigorous now, twining around the hazel poles, their crimson blossoms open like flags of some forgotten kingdom. Bees moved among them slowly, dipping in and out with practiced rhythm. Edric reached up to inspect the first pods, still young, slender, green, not yet filled. But the curve of them was right, the skin smooth and firm. Soon they'd swell with seed, and he'd choose which to eat fresh and which to dry for winter. The runners were a gift from his father's line, bold, showy, dependable. Beside them, the fire-tongue beans clung lower to the frame, their flowers a pale pink veined with white. These were subtler plants, quieter in form but rich in yield. Their pods, when mature, would turn speckled red and cream, like painted parchment. Edric reached beneath the leaves, fingers searching for the early pods, finding one, then two. He left them to grow, pleased. On the other side of the garden, where the sun lingered longer each day, the broad beans had already begun to fatten. Their black and white blossoms had faded, and now thick green pods hung heavy from upright stalks. Edric bent to gather a few, snapping them from the stem with a practiced twist. He opened one, revealing the pale, plump beans within, nestled in their soft-lined bed like pearls in moss. Hilda would mash them with garlic and oil, spread them on toasted rye, or stew them with herbs and a bit of salt pork. He remembered his mother doing the same, with a stone bowl and a wooden spoon, so worn its handle bore the marks of 3 hands before her. He moved next to the chickpeas, rare in these parts, but he had nursed them through spring under a sheet of wool to protect them from frost. Now their small, fern-like leaves trembled in the breeze, and the first pods were forming, tiny green, each holding 1 or 2 round seeds. A meagre harvest, but a meaningful one. He grew them not for yield, but for memory. A visiting tinker had gifted him the first seeds, and each year he saved what he could. Beyond the chickpeas, tucked near the wildflowers that danced along the edge of the hedgerow, were the lentils. They were always delicate, always difficult. The plants were low and sprawling, more weed than crop in appearance. But Edric cherished them. Each small pod held a single lens-shaped seed, and they required patience, so much patience. Harvesting lentils was an act of faith, a trust in the slow return. He knelt there for a long while, pulling back the foliage, letting his eyes trace the tangle of vine and stem. The earth beneath was dry here and warm, just as the lentils liked. He would not pick them yet. They were not ready. But he whispered to them, the way he did when he needed something to grow well. Not a plea, but a greeting, an understanding. In the far corner, half forgotten behind the rhubarb and horseradish, grew the lablab beans. He had not expected them to thrive, too tender for this soil, too foreign for this weather. But they had surprised him, climbing stubbornly up the wall, their leaves broad, their flowers violet. A few pods shimmered already, dark, curved, beautiful. Edric reached to touch one, surprised by its smoothness. He would not eat them. Not this year. He would save every pod for seed. Grow more next season. Share a few with Edith, perhaps, or offer some at the midsummer gathering. If anyone still asked for seeds. By noon, the sun had grown strong. He retreated to the shade near the stone bench beside the well, setting down his basket, half full, mostly broad beans, a few young peas, some early pods from the climbing vines. He drank from the dipper, cool well water running down his throat, and watched the wind move through the beans. They swayed, whispered, knocked softly against their frames. Each pod was a cradle, each leaf a hand. As he sat there, Aelith joined him, carrying a sprig of sweet pea flowers she'd picked from the garden's edge. "These don't make food," she said, holding them up to his face. "No," he said, "but they remind the others how to bloom." She tucked the flowers behind her ear and sat beside him. "Which one's your favourite?" she asked after a time. He thought for a long while, eyes scanning the rows, the neat, the tangled, the showy and the plain. "The ones that take the longest," he said, "that ask you to wait." She nodded, not entirely understanding, but willing to accept the answer. They sat together in the shade, the silence between them warm and full. Around them the garden grew, not loudly, not quickly, but deeply. The legumes swelled and twisted in their pods, the vines climbed, the seeds formed, and beneath it all, unseen but certain, the future ripened, quietly, in green silence. The summer solstice arrived without fanfare, no thunder, no high winds, no sharp cries of birds across the sky, only stillness. The kind of stillness that settled low over the fields and softened every edge of the day. Even the insects moved slower, their hums quieter, as if aware they stood at the very crest of the year's turning. Edric felt it in his chest as he rose, a gentle pull towards silence. The garden, too, seemed to hold its breath. This was not the heady chaos of early growth, nor the final rush of harvest. It was the pause between heartbeats, the moment between the inhale and the exhale. He moved without hurry, stepping out into the golden light with his hands tucked into the folds of his tunic. The garden, washed in morning sun, glowed softly. The paths shimmered with heat even at this early hour, and the leaves of every plant were open, wide as sails, ready to drink in the longest light. His work today would be gentle. No digging, no heavy lifting, only tending, seeing, listening. He began with the flax. The blue flowers had begun to fade now, their delicate petals falling like whispers onto the soil below. In their place, small green seed pods had begun to form, oval, pale, ribbed with fine lines. Edric crouched low, brushing the stems gently. They swayed in his hands, slender and smooth. Each pod would yield only a handful of seeds, but that was enough. Flax did not grow for greed. He had planted flax not only for its seeds, which Hilda used in baking and for poultices, but also for its fibre. In the leaner months ahead, he would soak and ret the stems, then comb them into thread, rough linen, the kind used for aprons and sacks. His mother had done it each year, her hands as skilled with flax as they were with bread. Past the flax grew the amaranth, rising tall and proud. Its leaves were crimson-veined, and the flower heads, still young, began to droop with the weight of promise. Edric admired them silently. Amaranth was both leaf and grain. The younger leaves, when picked early, were tender and earthy, but it was the seeds he waited for, the tiny grains tucked deep in the heavy flower plumes. When the time came, he would shake them into bowls, dry them by the hearth, and grind them fine. He remembered his grandmother cooking porridge from them, slightly sweet, with milk when they had it, or broth when they did not. It was the taste of survival dressed in the cloak of comfort. Beside the amaranth stood the millet. It had grown quickly this year, the heads already forming. Small, round and golden, they glistened in the light like beads strung on green stems. Millet was easy to overlook. It had no grandeur, no intoxicating scent or vivid colour, but it filled bellies when bread was scarce, and it cooked quickly over low flame, saving firewood and time. Edric ran his fingers along one of the heads. The seeds were still soft, not ready, but he could feel the density forming. It would be a good yield. Enough for gruel, for cakes, perhaps even for trade. Further down, the buckwheat had begun its bloom. Small white flowers clustered over the red-tinged stalks, giving the patch the look of snow scattered over rust. Buckwheat was fast, almost eager. It grew in poor soil, asked for little, and gave much. The grain was dark and bold, perfect for flatbreads and dumplings. Hilda mixed it with mashed turnips sometimes, or with lentils for a thick mash that clung to the spoon and warmed the stomach. He had sown it late, to catch the heat of the season, and it was thriving. Bees flitted over the flowers now, drawn by their faint perfume, and he left them to their work, knowing that what the bees gathered would return as honey, slow and golden, in the weeks to come. Near the edge of the fence, where the garden met the wild, he had sown a patch of barley. It was not much, just a small row, but enough to dry and roast, to grind or malt. Its awns shimmered in the breeze, and the heads danced like slender bells. He bent low, inspected the grain, ran a single kernel between his teeth. Still milky. Not yet. He did not grow oats. They had never done well in his soil. But behind the shed, shaded and secret, he kept spelt. A quiet grain, old and dignified. Its stalks grew taller than most, with husks tight and tough. Spelt demanded more labour to thresh, but Adric didn't mind. It was resilient. It fed his family when wheat had failed. It reminded him of strength without noise. He sat for a time beside the grain beds, his back against the warm stone wall. He watched as a dragonfly darted past, sunlight catching its wings. A lark rose from the field beyond, trilling briefly before vanishing into the sky. And he thought, not just of food, but of the way these grains had shaped everything. They were not the proud vegetables or fragrant herbs. They were not the showy climbers or sweet fruits. They were the foundation. Every loaf, every porridge, every thin gruel and hearty mash, every crust tucked into a child's palm. They had all come from these quiet plants, swaying in the sun, bowing under the weight of their small, powerful gifts. Back in the house, Aelith was shelling broad beans again, her fingers moving quickly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Hilda ground dried peas with a stone mill, the soft scrape filling the room like distant wind. Edric entered and laid the handful of flax stems on the table. "Not ready for seed yet," he said, "but the fibre will be good." Hilda nodded. "We'll soak it near the brook after midsummer. There's time." They worked in silence for a while, each absorbed in their task. Outside, the light began to shift, no longer rising but gently beginning its descent. The day would be long, still full of sun, but its peak had passed. The wheel had turned, and in the garden, beneath the bowing heads of grain and the rustling leaves, something deep stirred. Not growth now, but ripening. Not beginning, but becoming. The heart of the year had opened, wide and still, and in that stillness the forgotten grains whispered their ancient song, low, steady, and full of promise. The day after the solstice came with a hush. Even the cockerel crowed late, his voice muffled under the weight of the still, hot air. The sky had not clouded, but the light felt muted, thick, like walking through linen soaked in summer. Edric rose slowly, his muscles still from yesterday's crouching work, his thoughts already in the garden before his feet touched the floor. He knew what the day would ask of him. It was time to visit the fruits. Not the showy orchard trees, those he tended at season's edge, but the quiet fruits of the underbrush and garden margins. The small ones, the creeping ones, the ones that bore sweetness close to the soil. Forgotten by many, they required no orchard walls or ladders, only patience and the willingness to bend low. He started with the strawberries. The patch lay just beneath the hazel fence, where shade and sun met in equal share. They weren't like the large, uniform berries one might find in market stalls. These were small, misshapen things, wild strawberries, their scent 10 times stronger than their size suggested. Adric crouched and moved aside the leaves, searching. There, nestled in the green, blushed and ready. Berries no larger than his thumb's nail. He picked them gently, rolling each one into his palm, their scent rising like perfume from the forest floor. Aelith adored them. She would press them into oatcakes or stir them into goat's milk with a touch of honey. Even the smallest bowl made a feast. Further along, beneath a tangle of nettle and dock, grew the gooseberries. Their canes arched low, thorns waiting for careless hands. But Edric had learned their language long ago. He slipped between them without injury, lifting the leaves to find the fruit. Most were still green, firm and sour, the kind you used in pies with thick crusts and clotted cream. but a few had turned pink, nearly translucent, sweet, ready. He gathered what he could, letting the thorns scratch his arms. He didn't mind. Fruit was not meant to be free. It asked for effort. The best ones always did. Next came the currants. He had planted both black and red years ago, near the kitchen wall where the warmth would protect them from late frost. The black currants smelled deep and dusky, their flavour dark and wine-like. The red currants, lighter, more tart, clustered like drops of blood on thin branches. He picked them carefully, 2 bowls at a time. Hilda used them for preserves, sometimes for wine, always for comfort. He recalled winters when a spoonful of currant jam stirred into porridge had made the difference between another cold day and something like joy. Near the currants, a tangle of alpine strawberries had crept across the path. Not many noticed them, too small, too hidden, but Edric always did. Their sweetness came not in quantity but in surprise. A single berry crushed beneath the tongue was a memory in itself, of warm days and sun-warmed hands, of childhood and fields left behind. He passed the plum tree then, not yet heavy, its fruit still hard and green. It would be weeks before it softened. But beneath it, in the thicket of wild growth, grew the brambles. The blackberries were just beginning, their canes arching in wild spirals, their white blossoms turning to green bulbs that would soon blush red, then black. He reached into the thorns, testing a few. Too soon. He'd return later in the season with baskets and hooks and hands ready to be bloodied. But he marked their growth all the same. Knowing was half the work. At the edge of the stream that bordered his land, a patch of wild raspberries had taken hold. Smaller than the cultivated sort, but fierce in flavour. He waded through the tall grass, boots wet with morning dew, until he reached the edge. The raspberries hung like jewels, their drupelets still clinging to the centre cones. He picked a few, popped one into his mouth. It dissolved instantly. Sharp, bright, almost floral. He thought of his mother then, who had loved these berries more than any other. She used to dye cloth with them, their juice staining wool in shades of rose and dusk. He'd once asked why she didn't keep the berries for eating, and she had replied, "Because the cloth will last through winter. A berry's joy is quick." He stayed there for a while, listening to the water moving over the stones, soft and endless. A dragonfly skimmed the surface, its wings catching the sunlight like a shard of glass. The breeze stirred the raspberry canes. Everything moved just a little. When he returned to the cottage, his satchel was full, of strawberries, currants, gooseberries, and small handfuls of raspberry. Aelith ran to meet him at the door, her fingers already reaching for the berries, and he let her take the smallest strawberry, which she bit with reverence. Hilda was steeping herbs, her kettle singing, and she glanced at the fruit and nodded. "Gooseberry tart," she said, "and strawberry vinegar." Edric laid the fruit on the table, separating each with care. The house filled with the scent of ripe things, of summer concentrated into flesh. And as the sun climbed higher and the garden shimmered in the heat, Edric stepped back into its heart, listening for the quiet work of fruit, ripening in shadow, hidden under leaves, sweetening without sound. They didn't ask to be seen, only to be found. The evening came in low and amber, folding itself gently over the land like a woolen blanket. Shadows slipped across the garden slowly, drawn out by the setting sun, and every leaf, whether broad like burdock or narrow like fennel, seemed rimmed in light. It was a quiet, golden hour, the kind that whispered to the skin more than it spoke to the ears. Adric walked among the rows with a bundle of thin willow switches tucked beneath one arm. The day had been long, the heat lingering in the corners of the house, even after the fire had been banked low, but now the cool returned. The evening breeze, soft and grateful, moved through the garden like a sigh. Tonight he would tend to the flowers, not the ornamental ones planted for beauty alone, though they too had their place. No, these were the working flowers, the companions, the old friends that grew not for pride but for purpose, medicine, flavour, or the promise of life renewed. He began with the calendula. Their orange and yellow heads turned lazily toward the lowering sun, their petals a riot of warmth amid the green. He crouched to pluck the blossoms, snapping them off with thumb and forefinger, careful not to disturb the growing buds beneath. The petals were sticky with resin, an old sign of strength. Hilda would dry them for salves and wound balms, or scatter them into broth when someone in the house fell ill. Calendula healed slowly, but surely. Beside the calendula bloomed the borage, tall and unbothered, with flowers the colour of early dusk. Bees draped themselves over the star-shaped blooms, their movements drowsy in the cooling air. Adric never disturbed them. He simply waited, picking only from the lower stems, gathering the fallen blossoms from the grass. The flowers would be candied later, or steeped in cool water on hot days to lift the spirits. Some said borage gave courage, and though he never claimed to understand how, he did not doubt it. Next came the chamomile. Small and delicate, its white petals fell back from a bright yellow dome. These flowers had grown for centuries, seeded by wind and hand alike. Adric plucked them with reverence, dropping them into a linen pouch that hung from his belt. Their scent was soft but unmistakable, apple-like, clean, calming. Hilda would dry them for tea to lull restless sleep or ease a child's fever. He passed a tangle of nasturtiums then, riotous in orange and red, creeping over the stone path like spilled paint. Their leaves were broad, round and cool to the touch, the flowers bright and peppery. He picked a few to add to the evening meal, knowing Hilda would lay them over fresh bread and soft cheese. They were a bold flavour, sharp, almost wild, but in the heat of summer, they cut through the heaviness like a bell in fog. Further on, near the rain barrel, where moss gathered between stones, stood a thick patch of yarrow. Its feathery leaves grew in low mounds, and above them rose clusters of white, tightly packed blooms. Yarrow was old magic, passed down through hands that had forgotten even the name of the wound it first healed. Edric didn't use it often, but he liked to keep it near. Its scent, dry and herbal, reminded him of clean cloth and memory. At the edge of the path, growing between two stones as though no one had ever planted it at all, bloomed a small cluster of violets. Their season was nearly done, but a few stubborn blossoms remained. Adric knelt, brushed the petals gently. They had no use, not really. Not in his house, but their beauty required no explanation. And beyond them, in the shadier bed near the north wall, grew the feverfew. Its blossoms resembled tiny daisies, its leaves strong-smelling and bitter. Hilda swore by it for headaches, brewing it into strong, unpleasant tea. Adric had only tasted it once and had never forgotten the sharpness, like biting bark soaked in fire. But he kept it all the same. Some things weren't meant to be pleasant, only useful. He returned to the calendula to gather a few more heads, and then paused to watch the bees return to their hives, heavy with the day's labour. They moved with certainty, threading through shadows and light, as if pulled by strings no man could see. The garden had changed since spring. It no longer whispered promises, it gave. The colours were deeper now, the scents bolder, and the flowers, once soft and tentative, stood tall and wide, proclaiming their purpose without needing voice. As twilight spread, he sat on the low bench by the path, his pouch filled with blossoms, his hands dusted with pollen. Aelith brought out a cloth to wrap the flowers, and together they laid them out, naming each one in a soft rhythm like a song. Calendula, borage, chamomile, yarrow, nasturtium, feverfew. She paused over the violets and looked up at him. "What's this one for?" "Sometimes," he said, "things grow just to remind us what beauty looks like." She nodded solemnly, pressing the violet to her palm. Inside, Hilda had prepared a chilled brew of mint and elderflower, sweetened lightly with honey. The scent of it filled the air as the door opened, mingling with the night's own perfume, dry grass, warm stone, and a touch of thyme. As they sat to drink, the moon rose pale and steady over the roofline, casting its cool gaze across the garden, every flower now tucked into shadow, every petal folded gently inward. The day was done, and the flowers, those quiet companions of forgotten gardens, had done their work. No trumpet, no call, just scent, colour, memory, and something close to grace. The next few days passed in a soft hum of heat and distant thunder. Not a storm, not yet, but the kind of low grumble that lived on the edge of hearing, rolling across the hills, tugging at the corners of clouds. The garden responded in kind. Leaves grew heavier, darker. The air was rich, nearly too rich, like the breath before rain when the scent of soil and blossom and sweat mingled into something near holy. Adric moved slower in this kind of weather, not out of wariness, but in deference. The garden did not welcome haste now. It was a time for observation, not conquest. Today, his steps carried him toward the edges, the overlooked places, the margins where wild things grew. The cultivated rows had their order and care, but these boundary zones held secrets of their own. He began near the stone wall at the southern edge of the garden, where the mortar had long since crumbled and the earth pressed in with moss and creeping root. Here the first stalks of mugwort waved gently in the wind. Its leaves were silvery beneath, soft as lamb's ear, and its scent bitter and strange, somewhere between sage and memory. Hilda dried it for smudging and dreams. She said it kept bad spirits away, or invited good ones closer, depending on who you asked. Edric cut a few stems, binding them loosely with a thread of flax. He would hang them above the hearth to dry slowly, so the smoke would be sweet when burned in winter. Beside the mugwort grew wild thyme, creeping low over the stones, its scent rising warm and clean beneath his boots. He knelt and pinched a sprig, rubbed it between thumb and finger. The oil clung to his skin, sharp and bracing. He harvested just enough for seasoning, leaving the bees to their feast. Moving along the wall, he passed patches of self-heal, its tiny purple flowers low to the ground, its name whispered in nearly every old remedy book, for sore throats, for bruises, for wounds that wouldn't close. His grandmother had once boiled it with honey and nettle and poured it into a cracked cup, her voice quiet as she watched him drink. He had kept the taste in his mouth for years after. Further on, in the dappled shade of the elder tree, grew a cluster of wood betony. Its leaves were serrated, its flowers tall and reddish-pink, brushing against the branches above. Few in the village remembered it now, but Edric did. It was a plant for the mind, they said, for dreams, for worries, for the invisible weight that sometimes settled in the chest with no name. He picked a few stalks and laid them gently in the crook of his arm, careful not to bend them. Some he would dry for tea. Others he would press into pages to mark the season's passing. Near the edge of the field where the brambles grew thickest, he paused at a patch of meadowsweet. Its cream-coloured blossoms reached skyward, delicate as lace. The scent was sweet, nearly cloying, but with a hint of something medicinal beneath. Adric loved this plant most in late summer, when Hilda would use it to scent vinegar or brew it into a cordial to ease aching joints. He cut a small bundle, tied with twine, and moved on. Closer to the stream now, he passed the small clearing where valerian grew. It was tall, hollow-stemmed, its pink-white flowers clustered like clouds. The root, though, earthy and pungent, was what Hilda used. A sleep aid, she said, when even chamomile failed. Adric didn't use it often, but he respected it. Plants that worked on dreams needed to be approached with care. Beyond the valerian, nestled in the curve of the stream's bend, bloomed wild tansy again, its yellow buttons bright against the green. Edric let it be. He had taken enough last time, and tansy, for all its usefulness, was not a plant to be over-harvested. It had a pride to it, an ancientness, and he believed in honouring that. He sat for a while on a mossy log, watching the wind ripple through the tall grasses, the tips of which bent like they were listening to something beneath the soil. The air was dense, but not unpleasant. It held the breath of all the plants he had passed, bitter, sweet, grounding. It was strange, he thought, how these plants, so often called weeds, so easily pulled, trampled, cursed, held such history. Not just in their uses, but in their presence. They were the quiet witnesses, the ones who stayed when crops failed and seasons ran long. They grew in cracks and corners, in forgotten soil and broken walls. He remembered stories of midwives who carried bundles of these herbs tied to their belts, of wise men who slept with mugwort under their pillows to ward off bad dreams, of travellers who chewed thyme to clear their heads and courage their hearts. These were not vegetables. They did not fill a belly, but they filled something else. Returning home, his arms filled with the day's finds, he passed Hilda setting fresh linen on the line. She glanced at the bundles and smiled. "For the jars or the fire?" she asked. "Both," he replied, "and maybe a bit for the dreams." She laughed softly, taking the wood betony and brushing it across her cheek. That evening, while the children dozed and the fire burned low, Edric sat at the table sorting the plants. Some were hung from beams, others pressed between cloth. A few were dropped into a small clay pot with warmed honey to steep overnight. Outside, the garden rested. The moon was high, caught in the branches of the old pear tree. The wild herbs, scattered, quiet, uncelebrated, stood in their places at the edges of the world, holding firm. And in the house, in the soft light of beeswax and sleep, their presence lingered. Not loud, but constant. Like memory, like breath. The moon waned quietly in the nights that followed, its face growing thinner and dimmer, like a candle slowly melting into the wick. By day, the heat clung heavier than before, draping itself across the thatched rooftops and settling into the folds of linen clothes. The garden no longer sprang upward in joy. It held its weight close now, conserving its breath beneath broad leaves and shaded soil. Adric woke earlier than usual, drawn from sleep by the subtle change in the air. It was drier now, brittle at the edges. The birdsong, too, had shifted, still present, still sweet, but quieter, more measured. Even the bees flew differently, their paths tighter and lower, like they understood the heat had teeth. Today Adric would turn his attention to the roots again, not the ones he had sown in spring, nor those harvested in early cool. Today was for the buried strength, the ones that took their time, the ones grown not for flavour, but for function. He gathered his tools, a narrow spade, a wooden trug, a dull-bladed knife for prying, and made his way to the far corner of the garden, where the ground grew harder and the plants were fewer. This was the place he called the quiet bed. It bore little show, few blooms, mostly stalks and stems that stood rigid in sun and wind. But beneath them lived the old medicine. First was the angelica. The stems had grown thick and hollow, a pale green flushed with purple. Its flowers had long since passed, replaced by seed heads like miniature fireworks gone still. Edric cut them down gently, wrapping the seed heads in linen to dry. Beneath the stalks at the plant's base lay the root. He dug carefully, loosening the soil around it, feeling the resistance of its bulk. When it came free, it was thick, twisted and fragrant, sharp, earthy, with a hint of sweetness. Hilda would chop it and soak it in wine. It was good for the stomach, for the blood, for the kind of aches that came when the body had carried too many seasons. Next, he moved to the elecampane. This one grew tall, leaves wide and coarse, flower stems long gone brown. He remembered planting it in honour of his grandfather, who swore by its power in winter, a root steeped in honey and taken in spoonfuls when the lungs protested the cold. Adric pulled the earth back slowly, unveiling a root like a rope, gnarled, bronze, knotted. He smiled to himself. It was ugly, most of the healing roots were, but within its rough form lay strength. Not all cures were soft. Beside it, nestled low to the ground, grew valerian. He had harvested some weeks ago, but left a few plants to mature. The scent was stronger now, musky, almost animal. Not everyone could bear it, but Hilda used it sparingly, drying it in cheesecloth, mixing it with lemon balm and poppy seed when the night grew too long or the dreams turned cruel. He dug only one root, careful to keep the rest undisturbed. Valerian liked to be left alone. It gave what it chose, no more. Further down the row grew comfrey, the woundwort. Edric didn't need to dig its roots today, but he checked them all the same. Their leaves had grown thick, drooping slightly in the sun. He cut several for drying, then marked one plant with a stone. Its root would be taken in autumn, when it was richest. Comfrey could knit broken things, the old women said, bones, skin, pride. The last in the row was burdock. Its large, heart-shaped leaves rustled as he passed, and the burrs clung to his tunic as if unwilling to let go. Edric crouched and pulled back the soil, revealing a root long and straight, stretching deep into the earth. The Japanese had a name for it. He'd heard it once from a traveller, but here it was just burdock, a plant for the poor, for those who knew how to wait. He cut the root into lengths and laid them in the trug, brushing off dirt with a slow, circular motion. Later it would be soaked, peeled, sliced, stirred into stews, boiled with vinegar or dried for tea. When the digging was done, he stood slowly, his knees stiff, his palms darkened by soil and resin. The sun was higher now, casting long light over the tops of the brassicas, catching in the webs stretched between bean poles. He walked the rows once more, watching the plants breathe in the heat. He passed the squash vines, now thick with leaves, their golden blossoms curled in sleep. The cucumbers dangled from their trellises like quiet lanterns. The cardoons reached toward the sky, unmoved by the sun's press. Back inside, he washed the roots gently in the basin by the door, the water turning brown with the first rinse, then gradually clearer. Aelith helped dry them with old cloths, laying each piece out on a tray lined with straw. The scent of angelica filled the room, spiced and bright, like anise left in the sun. Hilda joined them, inspecting the valerian with a practiced eye. She said nothing, only nodded, then set a kettle to boil. They would steep a few roots tonight, only a little, just enough to quiet the dreams. As evening fell and the garden slipped into shadow, Edric sat by the open door, the trug of roots now empty, the trays lined and stacked. The quiet bed behind the garden looked unchanged, rough soil, scattered stalks, no beauty to speak of. But beneath it, the world worked, in silence, in darkness, in depth. And the roots, twisted, bitter, unseen, offered what they always had. Strength pulled from the deep, from the dark, from the places no one looked, but everyone needed. By the time the cicadas began to sing in the hedgerows, the garden had taken on a new stillness. Not the waiting kind of early spring, nor the industrious hum of midsummer, but the heavy stillness of a space that knows its work is nearly done. The leaves no longer pushed upward with vigour. They bowed now, thick with weight, with seed, with the memory of sun and rain. Even the birds had grown quieter, content to watch from shaded branches as the world turned slowly toward harvest. Edric stood beneath the eaves of the cottage, sipping a mug of barley tea as the last of the morning mist retreated toward the trees. His eyes wandered the garden paths, tracing the lines he had walked each day for months. There was satisfaction in it now, even as the weeds crept in at the edges and the vines pulled the poles sideways under their own burden. Today, his steps would carry him to the squash. He began in the western beds where the pumpkins and marrow had sprawled across the soil in great tangled blankets, their vines, thick as ropes, coiled and twisted with a kind of slow defiance, curling over paths and climbing the fence posts. Edric stepped carefully, mindful of the fruit hidden beneath the leaves, fat globes mottled with green and orange, swollen courgettes with skins tight and glossy. He bent beside the first pumpkin, brushing aside its leaf canopy to reveal a pale, knobbly shape nestled in the soil. Its skin was tough to the touch, its stem dry. Not yet ready to cut, but nearly. He marked it with a strip of red cloth, tying it gently around the stalk, then moved on to the next. Each fruit had a different shape, a different story. One had grown in the curve of a stone and taken on its imprint. Another had formed too close to the fence and bore a flat side, sun-dappled and firm. He counted 7 pumpkins worth keeping, 2 marrows for immediate eating, and 3 courgettes gone too large and seedy to be anything but fodder. Still, nothing was wasted. He picked the 2 smallest marrow, tucking them into the crook of his arm, and walked the length of the bed toward the edge where the patty pans grew. These little summer squashes with their scalloped edges reminded him of small suns. They grew quickly and without complaint, but needed watching. Leave them too long and their skins toughened, their sweetness lost. He picked 6, pale yellow and smooth, and laid them in his basket. From there he crossed to the eastern side of the garden, where the climbing squashes had begun their slow descent from the trellises. These were winter keepers, acorn, butternut, and the long, wrinkled fruits the villagers simply called keeper gourds. Their vines were thick with dust now, their leaves mottled with powdery mildew, a sign of the season's advance. Edric ran his hand along the length of one gourd, tapping it with his knuckle. The sound was hollow, a good sign. He cut it free with his curved knife and held it up to the light. Its skin was a muted green, streaked with gold, its body dense and curved like a shepherd's crook. He laid it gently into the basket and moved on. In the centre of the patch grew the bottle gourds, slender at the neck, bulbous at the base. These were not for eating, not anymore. Adric grew them for their shells. When dried and cured, they made flasks, ladles, and even small storage jars. He had once made a birdhouse from one, hanging it beneath the eaves for swallows in spring. They were still green now, still heavy with water. But soon, as the nights cooled, he would cut them and hang them in the rafters to dry. Returning to the cottage, the sun now fully risen and the air thick with warmth, Edric laid the squashes on the stone table near the door. Aelith came to inspect them, tracing her fingers along the ridges of the patty pans, holding up the gourd with a grin. "Like a bell," she said, tapping it gently. "Do they sing when you dry them?" "In their own way," Adric replied. Hilda emerged next, wiping flour from her hands, her apron dusted with fine white. She looked over the harvest, then picked up one of the marrows. "These for supper?" He nodded. "And one for Edith, she's been asking." Aelith ran off to prepare the gift, while Hilda turned toward the garden again. "They're heavier this year," she said, almost to herself. "Fuller, as if they know something." "They do," Adric murmured. "They always do." That evening, the marrow was stuffed with barley and herbs, roasted in the coals until its flesh grew soft and fragrant. The patty pans were sliced thin and laid over sour bread, drizzled with vinegar and a trace of honey. They ate outside, beneath the pear tree, where the lantern bugs had begun their flickering, and the sky bled slowly into dusk. The garden was quiet now, the squash beds still and drowsy in the failing light. The leaves had begun to curl at the edges, their season nearly over. But their work had been good. They had risen from seed, stretched across the earth, and brought forth fruit shaped by sun, soil, and shadow. And as the stars began to rise, one by one, like old names remembered, Edric watched the vines settle into sleep, their bodies coiled like stories waiting to be retold. The days shortened almost imperceptibly at first. Shadows grew longer at supper time, and the morning light came a breath later with each sunrise. The birds, once busy and loud, now sang only in the soft hush of dawn. Even the bees seemed fewer, their paths slower, their buzz more weary. The garden, too, knew. It had shed its urgency. The vines that once sprawled with insistence now curled inward, leaves thinning, fruits ripening all at once, as though called by some ancient agreement to prepare for ending. The soil was drier, the scent of it sharper, and everywhere, from the orchard to the bean poles, the colour of things deepened, purples, browns, ochres, earthbound hues that signalled ripeness, readiness, rest. Adric felt the change in his bones. It was the kind of shift not marked on any calendar, but felt in the turn of a wrist, in the stillness of a pond, in the way the wind spoke differently through the ash trees. On this final morning of the season's true labour, he walked slowly through the garden, not with a tool in hand but with a basket, empty and light, the kind used for collecting the last of what had been given. He began at the tomato rows. These were not the smooth red globes of market fare. His were streaked and lumpy, marbled with orange and yellow, some nearly black with ripeness. He picked them carefully, each one warm from the sun, each skin stretched tight with sweetness. He placed them gently into the basket, already smelling their richness in the rising heat. A few had split from the last rain, but even those would be used, roasted down or stirred into a thick sauce to be stored in clay pots for the darker days ahead. From there he moved to the beans. The vines were brittle now, their leaves yellowing and curled, but the pods still hung heavy, dry, papery, rattling when shaken. He smiled at the sound like tiny drums. He cut the pods and laid them out to dry fully on trays by the hearth. Later he and Aelith would crack them open, revealing seeds like polished stones, speckled, striped, in hues of cream and coffee and plum. Near the eastern fence, the sunflowers bowed low. Their great faces, once turned skyward with pride, now sagged beneath the weight of seed. Adric brushed a hand across the disk of one and watched a shower of kernels fall to the earth. He picked 3 heads to dry, their thick stems creaking as he bent them free. One would be pressed for oil. One would be fed to the birds in winter. The last, Hilda would toast and salt for small hands to snack on during the cold evenings. He passed the herb spiral, now overgrown, the thyme sprawling into the walkways, the basil gone to flower, the sage thick with dusty leaves. He let most of it be. What had not been harvested would be left for the bees and the soil. But he picked a handful of rosemary, its scent sharp and clear, and tucked it into his shirt. In the orchard, the pears had begun to drop. Not the golden ones yet, those he would pick in a few days, but the early bruised fruit lay scattered beneath the branches like forgotten offerings. He gathered what he could carry. Hilda would stew them with cinnamon and vinegar, or bake them with barley flour and nut oil. Nothing wasted. Not now. And at last he returned to the root beds, where the final carrots still clung to the earth, their green tops faded, their bodies hidden. He pulled a few, brushing off the soil. They were stubby this year, oddly shaped, but sweet, he knew. The cold had already kissed them. Back at the cottage, the table was cleared. The windows were thrown wide, and the scent of garlic and drying herbs floated in from the rafters. Hilda had already begun preserving, Jars lined the shelves, glinting with pickled onions, chutneys, cordials and jams. Aelith sat by the hearth, threading squash seeds onto string to hang above the fire. Toma slept with his head on her lap, clutching a wooden spoon carved like a turnip. Edric placed the basket of tomatoes on the table. The weight of it landed with a gentle thump, the fruits resting against one another like rounded stones in a river. Hilda smiled without looking up. "That's the last of them," he nodded. "The garden's gone quiet." She paused in her work, hands in flour, and looked toward the window. "It's waiting," she said, "for rest, and for us to remember." Later that evening, they ate simply, roasted roots with oil, toasted bread rubbed with tomato and thyme, pears softened in honey. The meal was humble but whole, drawn entirely from the soil beneath them, the sun above, the hands that had laboured in silence. After supper, Edric stepped outside one last time. The garden shimmered in the moonlight. The shadows between the rows were longer now, the beanpoles casting crooked silhouettes against the fence. Insects whispered in the grass. An owl called from the woods. He walked the path slowly, fingers trailing along fence posts and dry stalks. He stopped beside the first bed he had sown in spring, where the skirret once stood, where the sorrel first broke the soil, where he had whispered old names to seeds half forgotten by the world. He knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. It was still warm, still alive, still listening. The garden had not ended. It had simply turned. And beneath the surface, in silence, in patience, in the deep memory of root and seed, the next season was already beginning.